Hello, everyone. I see people are still joining in. Welcome to day 2 of Arab Center Washington, D.C.'s 6th annual conference. The conference is titled U.S. Policy and Global Competition in the Middle East. My name is Tamara Kharoub. I am the Assistant Executive Director and Senior Research Fellow at Arab Center Washington, D.C. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the second day of the conference, starting first with the opening keynote session, which I will be moderating. This year, we at Arab Center Washington, D.C. decided to dedicate the annual conference to exploring U.S. policies and objectives in the Middle East and North Africa, especially in light of U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and U.S. overall disengagement from the region. During these 3 days of the conference, we seek to assess the Biden administration's approach and U.S. influence in the Middle East amidst growing global competition, as we see Russia and China continue to vie for power and influence through diplomatic, military, and economic means. Yesterday, as some of you might know and may have attended, was the first day during which we had 2 very, very good panel discussions, one focusing on the impact of global power dynamics on human rights and democracy and on empowering authoritarianism, and the second exploring the status of energy transition and geopolitical economic relations. The videos of these 2 panel discussions are on our website. Feel free to check them out if you missed the day yesterday at arabcenterdc.org. Today's panels, following this morning's opening keynote remarks, will focus on 2 also important issues: the ongoing conflicts in the region and the role of global and regional players in the humanitarian security conditions in those countries and on political processes and prospects. The second panel later today will address trends and objectives in international arms transfer, especially exports from US, Russia, and China to the Middle East, and the human cost of weapons sales in the region. The third and final day of the conference will be this Friday, September 17th. I am very pleased to announce that we will start with an opening keynote address by a spokesperson from the US Department of State. Joey Hood will be joining us to deliver the opening keynote remarks on Friday. He is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, and he will give us an official American perspective on these issues that we're discussing during the conference. This will be at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on Friday. This will be followed by a keynote delivering the Arab perspective on these issues, and this will be presented by Tariq Mitri, who is former special representative and head of the United States Support Mission in Libya, and he's a former Lebanese government minister. The keynote session on Friday will be also followed by 2 panels assessing US policy in Palestine, Israel, and US policy towards Iran. I invite you all to stay with us for these interesting and important conversations today and on Friday. Feel free to check our website for the full program and the list of speakers at arabcenterdc.org. Finally, before I introduce our keynote speaker for today, I would like to remind everyone you can submit your questions to the speaker at any time using the Q&A feature of Zoom. You can also send your questions by email if you wish to events@arabcenterdc.org. You can tweet and follow today's conversation on Twitter using the hashtag ACW2021. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker who will kick off today's discussions, Dr. Brahim Fraihat. Brahim Fraihat is an associate professor of international conflict resolution and is the Dean of Student Affairs at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. He is also a non-resident fellow at Deakin University's Middle East Studies Forum in Australia. He previously served as Senior Foreign Policy Fellow at Brookings Institution and taught conflict resolution at Georgetown University and George Washington University. His latest books include Iran and Saudi Arabia, Taming a Chaotic Conflict, and Unjustified Revolutions, Yemen, Libya, and Tunisia after the Arab Spring. Dr. Fraihat has published extensively on Middle East politics, with articles appearing regularly in US and international media outlets. His research interests include conflict resolution and management, post-conflict reconstruction in the Arab world, national reconciliation, transitional justice, institutional reform, and political transitions in Yemen, Syria, Libya, and Tunisia, among other things. Thank you, Ibrahim, for taking the time to be with us today and deliver the opening address. Dr. Frihat's remarks are titled Arab Expectations of US Policy in the Middle East, Hopes and Realities. Ibrahim, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Tamara, and thank you, the Arab Center, for this important and timely discussion. And just before I begin, a small correction, actually, the book is called Unfinished Revolution, not Unjustified Revolutions, because that takes it to a whole different meaning. With that, I will begin my remarks on the subject that I was asked to talk about, to address, which is on U.S. foreign policy, a view from the region, a view from the Middle East. And with that, the very first thing that came to my mind, the view of who? Because this region is still in transition. It depends on where you stand and the way you look at the foreign policy and the expectations from the U.S. policy in the region. But nevertheless, I think there are certain areas. It doesn't matter where you stand. As an objective, independent researcher, you will have to look at these important points when you talk about the implications for U.S. policy in the region and the expectations as a result of that. And let me begin with the most recent, which is the most recent development, which is the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, and how this affected the view of the region, of the Middle East, of U.S. foreign policy and the relationship with the United States. The very first thing, the very first implication, and here I will talk about 5 points. The very first one is we're seeing vulnerable state building models built by the United States in the region, that these governments that the U.S. is building, they're vulnerable, discredited governments, whether it's in Afghanistan or in Iraq before, or the Palestinian Authority also that came as a result after the Oslo Agreement. So these governments that are built lack the local legitimacy in where they are built. And the moment the U.S. is leaving these areas, we are seeing these governments collapsing and also struggling to build legitimacy from within and the legitimacy with their own people. That's one. Second, I talk about the other implication, which is the abandonment of allies. And here, as we saw, the United States leaving Afghanistan and leaving the Afghani government after the U.S. withdrawal from them. And here, I would like, in my view, to emphasize that Kabul fell not in August 2021 with the American withdrawal on August 15. In reality, Kabul fell and the government collapsed back in February 2020, when the Trump administration signed the Doha Agreement with Taliban, with the Taliban rebels, excluding their own allies, excluding the Afghani government. So that's in fact where the Afghani government felt excluded, abandoned, and started the struggle of its own legitimacy with its own people. So during this time, to expect that the Afghani government in August 2021 that would sustain itself, that was far from reality. Because this is, again, going back to the region, this is not the first time where the United States abandons its allies. We saw this back in 2015 with the signing of the nuclear agreement with Iran, excluding also the traditional allies, US allies in the region, the Gulf countries. And that, as we know, that led eventually to deterioration of the security situation and then conflict escalation in the region. So here, in fact, for this to happen in Afghanistan and to watch how the US engaging with Taliban in direct negotiations and signing agreements without their closest allies, the Afghani government, being on the table or its interest being represented or on the agenda, this was not just scary for the allies or left them confused and vulnerable of their allies, but also it sustained a pattern since there are previous practices of US foreign policy in the Middle East, as we saw again in the region. And here it's important to think about the implications for this. And I think when we saw back in 2015, the direct implications was conflict escalation, this is always possible. But on the other hand, I think this also could lead to other developments. And in particular, this could also lead to conflict de-escalation, not necessarily escalation, as we saw in the Iranian nuclear deal back in 2015. How? Because the allies or the traditional allies of the US policy in the region are more becoming aware that they have to rely on themselves, that this traditional ally in Washington to protect them and being the sole security vendor and providing all the security assurances that they used to enjoy in the past, they're becoming more aware that this is not necessarily the case going to be in the future. So, in fact, we have seen some developments on conflict de-escalation. We saw some not rapprochement, but close relationships being developed or evolving between Egypt and Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, even UAE and Turkey as well. So again, the other important implication to this abandonment of allies, the parties are becoming, or the traditional allies becoming more aware that they have to build their own security strategy that relies on themselves mainly, not depending on others like the United States and others. So it depends on, as I started talking about this, it depends on where you stand and how you look at things and the lessons that you will be drawing as a result of this. But again, the evident or the important fact that's emerging that there is a pattern of US abandoning its traditional allies, and for that there are many lessons are being drawn. The third important implication, or the third important pillar, I would also say, as a result of this view, is that this US foreign policy that we're seeing in the Arab region is also leading to emboldened adversaries developing, the traditional adversaries, or with the United States also sending a message that there is a vacuum, a security vacuum is there as a result of the US withdrawal, and this needs to be filled by other parties. And here, I think the most relevant actors that are taking notes of this emboldenment of adversaries, we are seeing this in Iran, reflecting itself, in fact, in the most recent nuclear negotiations after the Brahim Raisi being in power. And also we're seeing statements from Iran saying that we have just very recently, 2 days ago, talking about the need for a mechanism to verify that the United States is really committed to the agreements that that the US is making. We never heard about this before. And also, it's the attitude that also developing. Why should I come negotiate with you since you are unable to defeat rebel fighters in Afghanistan, right, with the primitive weapons, right, like Taliban fighters? What, you are leaving the country without being able to sustain an ally there. So why should we be negotiating with you? Not only this, in fact, also we are seeing not only Iran, but also we're seeing this this attempt to fill the vacuum of more Turkey-Russia model of trying to present itself as resolving or managing at least conflicts in the region. We are seeing this in Syria, more of Turkey, Russia, reaching agreements and making arrangements. We saw it also in Libya as well, of more Turkey-Russia direct relations. And also, in fact, most recently also in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where we're seeing a Turkey-Russia arrangements is being enforced, is being implemented. And while the United States and Europe, right, becoming or less relevant or less important in the war or in the arrangement after the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The fourth element that I also would like to emphasize is about Arab liberals. And remember, the Arab Spring is never over. I think we are going through phases. We went through the first phase in 2011. Now, in 2019, we saw a second wave of revolutions in the Arab region, in Egypt, in Sudan, in Lebanon, in Iraq, back in 2019. So this kind of revolution or calls for change, democratization in the region, they're also getting the message, Arab liberals, that you are on your own. Do not expect much from the United States. Do not expect that the United States, would do much in order for, to help with the democratization in the region and to do something with the Arab Spring. And we, in fact, saw this being mainly emphasized by the Trump administration that made arrangements and alliances with dictators in the region so clear. But then that the Biden administration coming to power and making commitment towards supporting democracy and human rights in the world, while we're seeing this, in fact, ignored to a large extent in the region. And the Biden administration main points here is that we're not supporting dictators, but we're not fighting dictators either, right? So on that level, also this kind of a clear message or a clear policy that Biden administration is making, this is also has been received in a very disappointing attitude here and in skeptical views about the level of commitment or the level of support that the United States could provide to this movement of democratization or human rights support in the region, as it's being clearly communicated and clearly emphasized in most of the US official statements about the support to democracy and human rights in the world, while this is not being seen in the region. And I end with the elephant in the room, with the fifth point, right, which is always Palestine, and which is the pillar or the scale where the credibility of any US government and the commitment to working with the region or the commitment to building peace in the region is tested. To what extent that this new government is doing something to support or to help on that level. And here, I have to emphasize also is that, yes, there is an understanding, there is an appreciation that the aggressive, one-sided, oppressive conflict escalation Trump policy on deal of the century, what was called, that it's over. And it's no longer as part of the debate or the political debate with the arrival of the Biden administration. So there is this understanding and there is this appreciation, but at the same time, there is a huge disappointment on the level of the double standards. Again, while you make the commitments to supporting, again, human rights and democracy and peace and in the rest of the world, you're ignoring this in Palestine and you are not doing even the minimum. And the second level of, or the second indicator for this double standard, where the US, where the Biden administration is seen as undoing a lot of the damage that the Trump administration created for the right reasons, yes, whether it's the Paris Protocol, climate protocol, or in any other agreements, that the Biden administration is investing heavily in undoing a lot of the damage that was created in the rest of the world. The Biden administration is not doing even the minimum on the damage that the Trump administration created in what I call is the the escalation of the conflict in Palestine or the perpetuation of this conflict on that level with the policy that he used or that adopted during that level. And here are a number of indicators. While such, for example, moving the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the position on the refugees or the settlements, none of this is being done by the Biden administration on that level, not even restoring or reopening the American consulate in Jerusalem, right? That on that level is not being done. So there's absolutely the minimum on that level, while avoiding the main points or the main damage that the Trump administration created on that level, and being shy from taking any serious, bold positions on this conflict, as it is again the case of taking these bold positions on the damage that the Trump administration created in other parts of the world. And here I will stop, and I thank you.
Thank you, Brahim, for this very insightful and frank assessment of US policies in the Middle East and North Africa region. I would like to follow up with a question. So you've provided, these 5 points that are very interesting and eye-opening about, if you will, the failures of US policies in the region. In your assessment, what should the US be doing, if anything at all? And the kind of the other side of this coin, what should the Arab countries be doing as opposing to those failures?
Thank you. I think this is a really key question on understanding the relationship between the region, the Middle East, and the United States moving forward. And here I would like to emphasize again the fact, again, the disappointment from abandoning its allies. But this also, I will start with the Arab region, with the Middle East. I would like to start with is that this should be an eye-opening. It's a wake-up call. There are no justifications whatsoever is that you build your own national security strategy, where the main pillar of such a national security strategy is in the hands of an external government, right? And also is being or is subjective actually to domestic politics in the United States, depending on whose government, whether it's a Republican or a Democratic government in Washington, D.C., and how this is going to reflect itself on the policies in the national security of the region. So I think this is fair also, as you asked about the US. I think this is fair also for the United States and for the US government itself, is that this blanket guarantee of Middle East governments, right, including dictatorships, of being provided and protected and provided with all the reasons to engage in all types of human rights abuses, is that being a traditional ally and being providing the support, this should also end on the US level. Because I think we are at a point, we have an opportunity, is to have a more responsible relationship. And I think it's the time for this, for a responsible relationship between the region and the US government. That's fair for both, for the United States and for the region, because there are many lessons, as we started saying without repeating all what I talked about. Vulnerable government, discredited, lack local legitimacies, that they collapse after in less than 24 hours after the US withdrawal. This, Tamara, must end. It's the time to establish and build the foundation for a responsible relationship between the two parties.
Thank you, Ibrahim. We have a couple of questions in the last 2 minutes, so I'll just maybe relay maybe 2 or 3 questions and give you some time to respond to them. A couple of questions about undoing the damage of the Trump administration with regard to Palestine, Israel. One question asks, why do you think the Biden administration is hesitant to undo this damage by Kushner and Trump? And the second question, in your view, what should the Palestinian Authority do? What strategies should the PA adopt, given the hesitancy to undo the damages that the Trump administration has done? Question about China and Russia. Could they position themselves as the new protectors of the Gulf countries? And one more question really quick, we don't have a lot of time. Wouldn't a Pan-Arab Union similar to the EU provide greater stability? Or is that only an option for scramblers? That's what the person is asking. I'll give you a couple of minutes to answer those questions and provide some concluding remarks. Go ahead, Ibrahim.
Thank you, Tamara. Well, this question needs another conference probably to answer that. Let me start with Palestine, and I think this is really great question. One, I think why there hasn't been serious engagement by the Biden administration, I think for important reasons. The U.S. administration has its priorities. I mean, during the time, the health situation in the U.S. during the COVID-19, also, the relationships, the domestic relationships in the United States, and also the relationship with Russia and China and all of that. So there are definitely domestic and foreign policy priorities that are not helping the Biden administration, and this is understandable. But nevertheless, I don't think this is a justification, is to do the minimum or the, creating or undoing the damage, at least if you don't want to engage in peace building like the way that the Obama administration did, again, understanding the other priorities, but about the damage, you can't just leave this damage on levels of mainly Jerusalem and the settlements. The Trump administration take the most aggressive positions on these issues, right? While we're not seeing even the minimum by the Biden administration. And also another reason, also to continue to be fair and objective, I think also the Palestinian leadership bears a responsibility for not taking action. because we have the Palestinian divisions within the Fatah Hamas. We have no elections. Both governments, Fatah and Hamas, also struggle with local or domestic legitimacy on that level. So I think this is also another reason that also the Palestinian leadership, both Fatah and Hamas, bear responsibility or contribute to this reason. Now, the other question, if you allow me just in 1 minute touch on it, whether Russia and China will present themselves as the protectors of the region. I can answer on behalf of China, or at least not just my own analysis from all the conversations that we had with Chinese officials and experts and all of that. The answer is no. And we will never aim to do this, right? And the answer we always got, we don't have neither the interest nor the capabilities to do so. So forget about us. Now, as for Russia, I think Russia is taking more of an opportunist approach, is that making very careful calculations about certain conflicts or certain areas. Wherever an opportunity presents itself and there is some potential on that level, we are seeing that Russia is stepping in on that level and to provide, yes, to fill some sort of the vacuum that the United States has created by its disengagement. So, but I do not think that Russia will present itself, at least in the near future, as the alternative protector or the alternative security provider in the region, whether it's in the Gulf or the rest of the Middle East, because Russia also understands its limitations. And we saw some engagement on that level in Libya, Syria, Nagorno-Karabakh, but after that, I think Russia thinks very well before extends its intervention in other areas.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. And with that, we have reached the end of this first session of today's program. Many thanks to you, Ibrahim, for these excellent remarks and very eye-opening analyses. And thank you for your time. Thanks to all of you who joined us. And apologies to those whose questions we didn't get the chance to get to. Please remain online with us. Panel 3 of the conference, titled Conflicts and Greater Power Competition, which focuses on Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Yemen, will begin shortly. We will take a very short 5-minute break so we can transition to the next group of speakers. Please stay with us, and thanks again to Ibrahim.
Ahmad and panelists for session 3, are you guys with us?
Yeah.
Can you guys enable your cameras, please? Okay.
عماد كيف حالك؟
أهلا وسهلا.
Yeah, hi.
سلامات.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to finish something. I'm not quite paying attention. Alhamdulillah, ماشي الحال. كيفك أنت؟
هلا مرحبا.
All right, guys, 60 seconds. Ahmed, when you see the banner come down, you can start.
Yes, sir. أهلا. Hi, Hanan.
أهلا.
How are you?
كيف حالك؟ I'm good. How about
الحمد لله.
yourself?
كيف الحال؟ يا
تمام،
مروان
الله
شو
يسلمك.
أمورك؟
تمام.
سلامات كيف الحال؟
10 seconds.
كنت عم بخلص جملتين بآخر
All
my
right, Ahmed,
remarks.
أنا
let's
كان عندي شوية مشاكل بالاتصال بعتقد بس نحله يعني.
Okay, we're on.
Go ahead. We're live.
Good morning. My name is Ahmad Harb, and I am the Director of Research and Analysis at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Welcome to this panel of ACW's 6th annual conference titled U.S. Policy and Global Competition in the Middle East. Our session, this panel 3, is titled Conflicts and Greater Power Competition, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Yemen. This session will cover some of the ongoing conflicts in the region and explore the role of global and regional players in those conflicts across the Middle East and North Africa, the impact of external involvement and intervention on the humanitarian and security situations, political agreements and political and diplomatic processes, and the prospects for resolving those conflicts. The panelists will try to provide some policy recommendations for UN envoys, European states, and the Biden administration by outlining some policies that would contribute to ending these conflicts. Today, we have a number of experts, one for each case of discussion. They will be speaking in the order in which I would introduce them. Hanan Salah, she is the Libya director at the Human Rights Watch. Harith Hassan, he's a non-resident senior fellow, Malcolm H. Care Carnegie Middle East Center. Helen Lackner, she's a visiting fellow at European Council for Foreign Relations, research associate at the School of Advanced Studies at the University of London. And Marwan Qabalan, director of the Unit for Political Studies, Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies in Doha, Qatar. Each of the panelists will have about 12 minutes, give or take, to present their remarks, after which we will open the floor to questions. Please send your questions on the Q&A feature on your Zoom page, or send them to events@arabcenterdc.org, events@arabcenterdc.org. It would be nice to identify yourself and your affiliation when you ask your questions. Please send short questions so that we may have enough time to entertain as many questions as we can. Also follow the proceedings on Twitter at #ACW2021. We will start with Hanan Salah. Hanan, the cyberspace is yours.
Thank you so much, Ahmad, and good morning or good evening to everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you today. I will try to stick within the limits of what you just introduced, so bear with me a little. So I cover Libya for Human Rights Watch and have been doing this for. I'll start with a brief overview of the current political and security landscape, just so that everyone is on the same page. I will give a brief on the human rights and humanitarian conditions currently and the concerns that Human Rights Watch has, or the major concerns that we have. And then more specifically, I will talk about foreign intervention, the effect that it had. And then at the end, I will try to come up with some policy recommendations and some thoughts. So needless to say, this has been a turbulent decade in Libya with intermittent conflicts, political divisions, and a total breakdown in central governance that has only now started to rebuild. In fact, foreign intervention has been a factor since day one. And with that, I mean actually since the 2011 revolution. But the intensity of foreign intervention in Libya definitely peaked in 2019, the 2019 conflict, where we saw robust interference and intervention by particularly the UAE, Egypt, Russia, Turkey, especially at the military level, and others, mostly European states, who gave political cover. As a result of that, the conflict has stretched on. And as a result of that, of course, the human rights and humanitarian situation in the country were seriously affected. So human rights conditions today in Libya for Libyan residents continue to be very, very tough, and justice remains elusive. A ceasefire has been placed for almost a year now, since the end of the conflict in Tripoli. And Tripoli anti-violence. And the conflict ended in June 2020, and a ceasefire was reached in October. And since March this year, a government of national unity has nominally replaced two competing governments in the East and West. There was an agreement, there was the House of Representatives actually agreed to it. But I say nominally because even now, 6 months later, the government that is officially backed by the United Nations, officially backed by the entire world, if you will, is yet to take effective control over the entire territory of Libya. The Eastern Armed Group, Libyan Arab Armed Forces, also known as the Libyan National Army, under the command of Khalifa Haftar, remains very much in effective control in Eastern Libya and in large parts of the South, as some of the clashes currently underway in Southern Libya show that this is all sort of far from being over. And the unity government, the new government, is struggling to assert itself at the institutional level, but also at the security level. And with that, I mean a unified military. Now, the country, of course, is still reeling from mass displacement. Thousands and thousands are internally displaced after the conflicts this past decade. Dozens dozens of disappearances, the discovery of mass graves, unlawful killings, and the remnants of landmines and other unexploded ordinances that even now, 15 months after the formal end of the conflict, continue to kill civilians. The infrastructure is degraded, and of course, vital infrastructure such as hospitals, schools, and the electric grids are really struggling to keep up with the needs of the population, which means that people have no continuous access to electricity. Sometimes electricity remains off for a very long time, and the public health sector has been decimated due to conflict, but also years of neglect and corruption is also struggling to keep up, which of course is not helpful during this major pandemic. And in addition to that, I would also say that the armed groups that are linked with the authorities and also the armed group in Eastern Libya have been responsible for holding thousands of people in long-term arbitrary detention. They've also been responsible for abuses and arbitrary detention of migrants and asylum seekers and enforced disappearances, but also other violations such as confiscation of private property. And then another issue I think that is incredibly important, especially with possible elections looming towards the end of the year, is really the shrinking space for NGOs and activists, and the fact that civic groups are finding it so difficult to operate in Libya and are being directly targeted, even by this new government's repressive policies, who are also trying, like every government before it, to regulate the work of NGOs to the point where foreign groups are currently facing massive hurdles even in being able to operate for the lack of visas, for example. And local groups are intimidated and are asked to fulfill really a ridiculous number of criteria in order to be able to operate. Women activists who have spoken out have felt huge repercussions on issues such as gender-based violence, for example, or other issues such as personal rights, inheritance issues, or marriage, or any other issue, in fact. And activists continue to be under enormous pressure from armed groups. Journalists currently still self-censor. They risk attacks and harassment. There's hardly any independent news outlet in Libya, or even members of independent international media who are continuously based there. So the view that comes out of Libya, or the narrative that comes out, is very much what politically motivated and politically linked media groups are feeding. And this is, of course, as I said, particularly relevant because of potential upcoming elections at the end of this year, where the discourse should really be about whether conditions are right for free and fair elections. But that currently is not the case. All of this is happening with impunity. Since 2011, I'm not aware that a single member of an armed group has been convicted for arbitrary detention or torture or disappearances. And after 7 years of political divisions, particularly since 2014, domestic courts and the criminal justice system are still not fully functional. And where processes take place, we have seen major violations of due process. Other venues for accountability, such as the International Criminal Court, that does not have the fastest pace when it comes to issuing arrest warrants, and has not managed to have a deterrent role for serious abuses. There are other venues, such as Security Council sanctions regime and the arms embargo, which so far has proven to be toothless because it's not being implemented, despite very meticulous reporting by the panel of experts of the Security Council. Now, more specifically on foreign intervention, of course, since 2011, there has been major foreign intervention in Libya, starting with the NATO operation that resulted in regime change. But after, let's say, 2000, not that nothing happened in between, but after 2014, when the second war broke out, when Khalifa Haftar from Eastern Libya announced his so-called war on terror, which of course was an oversimplification and misleading attempt to control the narrative, namely that he wanted to control the country. It worked, and it resulted in a split governance. It resulted really in two governments that were active until very recently. Foreign countries and entities have intervened differently in Libya. So they have, some of them obviously have intervened by giving political cover, such as France and Italy, who have taken opposing sides in this conflict. And for the past 5 years or so, have been real spoilers in the Libya context. But they, by giving cover for example, France giving cover for Khalifa Haftar, who is, after all, a warlord. On the other hand, there are countries, including the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Russia, Turkey, Jordan, but also others, including Qatar, to a lesser extent, who have quite openly supported conflict parties with military equipment, trainings, and provision of foreign fighters. And that has been a game changer, really, in this conflict. Of course, this is all a violation of Security Council mandated arms embargo. And what really reached its peak in the 2019 conflict is the provision of weapons and fighters, especially foreign fighters. Currently, there are still thousands, even though the conflict has formally ended, but still thousands of foreign fighters remain, fighters who were supported by Russia and brought in by Russia to support the Eastern groups that included fighters from Syria, but there are other private military companies as well, who, including from Russia and other countries who have been active as well, but also individual Chadian and Sudanese fighter and also whole units of rebel fighters from Chad and Sudan, who, by the way, supported both sides of the conflict. On the other side, there are still a number of Syrian fighters who were brought in by Turkey who remain in Libya. I would say that this presence of the foreign fighters is really a real marker for where currently things stand. Specifically on the United States, the US had a light footprint in Libya since 2011 that became even lighter after the killing of Ambassador Stevens. And there have been some individual targeted killings, mostly in southern Libya, which the US has justified under its war on terror. But really, the US has become a little bit more active in this conflict. And since Russia has taken a more prominent role, that may have had something to do with it. Of course, in terms of policy recommendations, I'm saying that my time is dwindling away, but for policy recommendations, I think that there are some recommendations, particularly that are very concrete, that I would give on massive reform needs of the Libyan judiciary. This is incredibly important, especially in view of upcoming elections, in view of elections for a parliament and for a president, where there is a real need to review the penal code, to be able to try people for war crimes and crimes against humanity in a system that is largely confessions-based criminal justice system. For the security sector reform, a joint military committee is currently negotiating how to merge fighters into one national force. I would say that the sticking point here will be vetting. And I think that a recommendation that I would give is to look very closely at criteria for vetting and to absolutely not accept a unit that is wholesale brought and merged into a future force, but rather really to look at the individual and their possible implication in serious human rights violations. I have some other comments to make, but I think I will probably end it here, and I'll be happy to answer any more questions that others may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hanan. Appreciate it. Harith, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I will focus in my remarks on Iraq and the role of global and regional powers in the country, and in particular, I will focus on the impact of the US-Iranian competition on the situation in the country. So I will start with a brief description of the situation in Iraq, then move to address the regional context and the US and Iranian policies in the country, and conclude perhaps with an assessment of Iraq's position in the region. So first point I want to make regarding the situation in Iraq is that next month Iraq will hold its first yearly election, which has been decided as a result of the wave of protests that erupted in 2019 and forced the government of Adel Abdel Mahdi to resign. Mustafa al-Kadhimi's government was formed as a transitional government, aiming to lead the country through the crisis and secure better conditions for the election. But today it seems that the dominant political and paramilitary factions managed to absorb the shock caused by the protests and develop mechanisms to infiltrate the protest movement, as well as use tools of intimidation and violence against activists. And it seems that the current system of power sharing, of institutionalized patronage, and the collaboration between political parties and militias proved to be resilient. And that was helped, of course, by the recovery of oil prices, which is Iraq's main source of income. So the next election is not likely to produce a very different political map. The same major parties that won last election are expected to win most votes, perhaps with a relative alteration in their number of seats. But the election could aggravate the political crisis rather than solving it, especially in the case of widespread fraud that delegitimizes the process, or in the case of failure to form a new government because different parties cannot reach a consensus. Additionally, there has not been a substantial change with regard to the structural problems that led to the crisis. Unemployment rates are still very high. Corruption and the weak rule of law is a characteristic of the current situation. Extra-legal violence is very common, along with the existence of powerful militias and paramilitaries. Still, I think the main success of Kadhimi's government was by keeping the ship afloat and reducing the likelihood of the total collapse and chaos. My second point is about the regional context. Iraq continues to be a fragile state that does not fully control its territory. There are several powerful non-state actors. Some of them are part of regional alliances or hostilities, and this includes the Iranian allied paramilitaries, the PKK, which in the last few years managed to expand its territorial reach in Iraq and has been subjected to regular military attacks by Turkey in the north of Iraq. And there is also, of course, ISIS, which remains much weaker than some years ago, but is still able to orchestrate dangerous attacks on Iraqi forces. Yet I would say that recently the main source of instability in Iraq has been the hostility between the United States and Iran. Both countries have significant influence in Iraq, with the balance, in my view, the balance increasingly tilted in favor of Tehran, which appears today as the most influential foreign actor in Iraq's political and security scene, despite the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in a US strike in January 2020. Iran gradually and patiently managed to design alliances with several local groups. It used the war against ISIS to strengthen allied military factions that are now part of the state structure within the Popular Mobilization Forces. Also, Iran managed to develop working relations with Sunni and Kurdish groups that came to accept the reality of the Iranian influence in Iraq, to the extent that Iran today plays the role of mediator or broker between these groups and other Shia factions. So, in building this leverage, Tehran benefited from the pan-Shia solidarity and from its early support for the Shia-dominated government after the fall of Saddam Hussein regime, and also during the war against ISIS, especially after the collapse of the Iraqi army. While most other regional powers were either less enthusiastic in backing the post-2003 order, or heavily relied on the American leverage to check the Iranian influence. This leads me to my next point, which is about the US policy in Iraq. Before Trump administration came to power, Washington and Tehran accepted some degree of coexistence in Iraq, especially as both countries agreed that Sunni jihadism was the main threat in the country. And also because the priority of Obama administration at the time was to withdraw its troops from Iraq. Trump and his team adopted more hawkish policy towards Iran and tied the US presence and influence in Iraq to the priority of confronting Iran. Following the assassination of Soleimani, both Tehran and Iranian allied groups in Iraq made it a priority to expel US troops from the country, and they put a huge pressure on Kadhimi's government to implement a non-binding decision by the Iraqi parliament to end US military presence in Iraq. The departure of the remaining American troops, whose number today is about 2,500, I think their departure could represent a significant symbolic victory for Tehran, because as we know, Tehran made it its key objective to end the US hegemony in the region. While for armed groups that prioritize this issue, it has been a way also to intimidate Kadhimi's government, which they viewed as very friendly to Washington, and also to employ the rhetoric of resistance to American occupation in order to justify keeping their arms and weapons and their independence from the Iraqi government in a way reminiscent of Hezbollah in Lebanon. For Biden administration, which includes many people who previously worked in or on Iraq, including Biden himself, who supervised the US policy in Iraq when he was vice president in Obama's administration. And for this administration, it is obviously they try to disconnect to some degree their policy in Iraq from that of Iran. They're adopting a less hawkish position towards Iran, which is why this administration is also trying to support Kadhimi and commends his efforts to rein in armed groups and to rebalance Iraq's foreign relations, especially after Kadhimi managed to open up to the Arab world and made some successes in improving relations with Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Jordan. Probably this is one reason why the administration seeking to decrease the internal pressure exerted on Kadhimi by Iranian allied groups. This administration announced that it would end the presence of US combatant troops in Iraq by the end of this year. This announcement so far helped to de-escalate tension. But if there will not be a breakthrough or some sort of improvement in the relationship between the United States and Iran in the coming months, especially concerning the revival of the nuclear deal, this is potentially going to be a cause for escalation in Iran, especially given that Iranian allied groups interpreted the announcement as a promise to withdraw all American troops, while the US government framed it as an end for the US involvement in combat operations against ISIS, rather than the end of the US military presence altogether. So clearly, the US withdrawal from Afghanistan has emboldened these groups, at least in their rhetoric. I mean, like widespread perception that the United States is actually disengaging from the region. But at the same time, the situation will depend on the progress in the negotiation between the United States and Iran, as well as on the outcome of the Iraqi election and the nature of the next government in Baghdad. I suspect that events in Afghanistan will make Biden administration hesitant about implementing a full withdrawal from Iraq, but it will have to consider the expected cost and what kind of reaction must be adopted if militias committed major attacks against US troops. So what I think is that considering this administration's preference to avoid the option of starting a major conflict with Iran, Washington would try to find a new formula for coexistence or perhaps collaboration with Iran in Iraq, which implies a recognition of Iran's role as a guarantor of the existing political order in the country. My final point here is about Iraq's response to this regional context. Kadhimi's government acted as a mediator between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and just recently held a regional conference which seemed to be part of its efforts to mitigate rivalries between its neighbors, especially Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, and also to balance the Iranian influence by bringing in other regional actors, while at the same time providing Tehran with a forum for dialogue with those actors. This is could be just a nascent and perhaps a one-time event, but its importance, I think, is in the fact that it reflects the need for a new regional skeleton that embodies the emerging balance of power in the region, as well as the fact that the United States is currently gradually disengaging from the Middle East. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Harith. Appreciate it. Helen, your turn.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever people might be. First, I want to thank you for inviting me. And second, I think I was asked specifically to talk about international aspects of the Yemeni war. So that's what I'm going to do. But I want to remind everybody before we start on this, that the Yemen conflict is primarily an internal civil war. And so, you know, one should not assume that the external agents have that much influence or power. And now I basically plan to cover three aspects of the international involvement. First, the military, second, the humanitarian, and third, the political. Militarily, as I'm sure most people know, there is direct military involvement from Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who officially support the same side, but in practice are increasingly supporting different sides, and indeed sides that are in opposition to each other. So the KSA is primarily supporting the official internationally recognized government of President Hadi, and in practice is active in the northern part of the country and has a few troops in various other locations, but it's mostly involved not so much with its own military forces. On the other hand, the UAE, who officially withdrew of their military forces, though officially they remain part of the coalition in 2019, they are really primarily involved in the south, or mainly their strategic objective, I think, is to focus on the maritime routes and on their rising, I think, maritime ambitions. And in this process, it's very much supporting one of the southern separatist factions. Just in case people don't know this, Yemen was two separate states until 1990, and I won't go into that now unless I'm asked. So basically, you have a situation where you have the two members of the GCC supposedly in the same alliance, where they are in an alliance, supposedly supporting the same group, but in practice not quite doing so. In addition to that, both of them have been using Sudanese, mainly Sudanese mercenaries, whether one calls them mercenaries or not could be debated. And most of these were withdrawn after 2019 when the revolution took place in Sudan. But I think there may be a few left. And the UAE has also financed some private groups, including some American groups, in order to attack the people whom they consider are really their prime enemy, which is the Islah Party, which is in part a variety of Muslim brothers, but not exclusively so, and which is a major element of the internationally recognized government, which is one of the reasons, or maybe the main reason, why the UAE is not very close to this internationally recognized government. Now, the third element I just want to mention on the military front, which is maybe closer or of closer interest to people in the US and elsewhere, of course, are the arms sales, which I trust a lot more will be said about in the next session. But basically, both the Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and indirectly the internationally recognized government, get their weapons primarily from the US, France, and the UK, and other major Western arms dealers. Incidentally, it's worth pointing out that the other side of the war, i.e. the Houthi movement, which are a much less financially and in other ways supported, are also using these same weapons, usually because they've either captured them or bought them from the internationally recognized government. So I'll now move on quickly to the humanitarian situation. The humanitarian situation, as I trust everybody knows, is notoriously disastrous. It's known that it's been for the last 3 or 4 years described as the worst humanitarian situation in the world by the UN. There are basically 2/3 of the Yemeni population are considered to be in need of humanitarian assistance in one form or another, and that represents close to 21 million people. It's been officially stated that 16.2 million of people are food insecure, which is, I think, the new modern euphemistic speech for hungry and having very serious problems, of whom 5 million are now described as being one step away from famine. I think it's important to mention the fact that, you know, although there's been talk of famine in Yemen for the last 3 or 4 years, there is no declaration of famine made by the United Nations. And that's basically for 2 main reasons. One is that there are certain statistically data that need to be demonstrated for the UN to provide such a declaration, and the statistics for such things are simply not available in Yemen, nor indeed, in my view, in many of the other countries where such issues arise. And the second one, of course, is that it would prove that what I calculated earlier today, the 17.5 billion US dollars that have been poured into or have been used in relation to Yemen since between 2015 and 2020 have not achieved very much if you then admit that you've actually got famine in the country. But now they're saying that there are actually close to 50,000 people in famine situation and another 5 million one step away. My belief is that, you know, famine is in existence in Yemen and that there are millions of people who are dying directly and indirectly from hunger. And on this point, it's really worth reminding people that far more people are dying from this than are dying through bombings or actual fighting. And of course, most of these people are civilians and children and the people who are technically more vulnerable. Now, why are we in this situation? We are in this situation primarily because of the war, though you already had a high poverty level before the war started. And you have, you know, what the blockade of the Red Sea ports, which is, you know, mainly Hodeidah and the other ports, which are where both fuel and food are not arriving in the quantities required. Moreover, they're costing a lot more than is needed. So although 70% of Yemen's population is rural, the country has been dependent on imports for 90% of its basic staples, i.e. basically wheat and rice, for the last 2 decades. That's another long story which one could go into in great detail. So basically the blockade and the price increases combined with the collapsed economy and the fact that millions are not being paid mean that although there may be food in the shops to some extent, people can't afford to buy it. And that's, you know, and of course people are weakened, the medical services are in an advanced state of collapse, and therefore people are suffering very badly. Now, just to look at the situation in 2021, the UN's humanitarian response plan, for which they asked for $3 point something billion, is currently, as of yesterday, funded at 54%. Now we're well into the 3rd quarter of the year, which means that there is very serious shortage of funding for this humanitarian plan, and therefore, of course, that this is worsening the situation and the likelihood of starvation for thousands, if not millions. It's of course also worth noting who is paying and who is financing the humanitarian plan. And of course, the main financier of this is the main aggressor in Yemen, namely the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which has financed 35% of what's been financed, followed by the US, which has a major role also in humanitarian support, which has financed 20%, followed by Germany 10%, and the UAE 9%, the EU and UK each at 70%. So I think, you know, this gives an indication of the state of the humanitarian affairs. The other thing, of course, is the distribution and the way humanitarian aid is used. And that is another very fundamental problem in the country, because on all sides, humanitarian aid is very politicized. There have been serious conflicts on the issue between the Houthis and the United Nations system. There are also regular complaints. There's also a large amount of humanitarian aid, which is not going through the UN system, which is going directly from the KSA and the UAE through their own mechanisms. And that is going into, is not, none of the aid is systematically distributed according to need. In addition to the fact that the people in greatest need are the people in the most remote places, and therefore those who are most difficult to reach, and therefore who have the least money to buy things, where the cost is increased, etc. So we have a very complex situation. And of course, the multiplicity of organizations involved, I mean, between the UN and the NGOs and the contractors, every institution takes their share, which is why I was talking about the amount of money that's been allocated to Yemen. This is not the amount of money that's reaching Yemen, let alone the amount of goods that is actually reaching the people in need. So you have, major issues on the humanitarian situation, but you also have a major problem of people, suffering enormously and dying in their thousands in places where they are not seen. So the third thing I want to talk about briefly is the political situation and the international role in the particular political situation. So obviously the main role is from the main belligerents. So we're talking about Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the officially internationally recognized government, and the Houthi movement, who are supposedly always described in the media as Iran-backed. Very, very briefly, I'll say something about the Iranian backing. The Iranians are certainly, Iran, which had almost zero role in Yemen 10 years ago, has increased its role and participation in the course of the war, and since 2015 in particular. But it is a mistake to call the Houthis Iranian proxies. Iran is supporting them. It's costing very little from the Iranian point of view. This is an incredibly cheap operation to irritate the Saudis very successfully. But they are helping the Houthis basically with some of the super advanced technology for their missiles and their drones, none of which I understand any details of. But that is the reason the missiles and drones that have been used by the Houthis in the last 2 or 3 years are increasing in capacity. The second, of course, international element that I want to bring is the United Nations. The United Nations is constrained objectively by the terms of the United Nations Security Resolution 2216 of 2015, which is completely out of date and is no longer a basis for serious negotiations. It might have been such a basis for a few months, but by 2016, it was already vastly out of date. And that has two major problems. The first one is that it demands the Houthis withdraw from everything they've gained since 2012 or 2013, which, given that the Houthis are on the offensive and winning and expanding, is not likely to have any impact on them. And the second element is that it describes the President Hadi's government as legitimate, and therefore it's the only, the UN envoy cannot actually address other people without dealing with this internationally recognized government, whose presence on the ground is extremely limited. Extremely limited by, I mean, very, very low. So on this one, we have, and you were talking about possible recommendations or what can be done. So I'll finish off with the UN before moving on to the US. We have now a newly appointed UN Special Envoy to Yemen, who just started work 10 days ago today. He is...
I'm sorry to interrupt you. 1 more minute, please.
What, 1 minute? Oh, I thought I had 12 minutes.
Yes,
okay.
It's been 14. Thank you.
Okay, I apologize for that. So basically, he has the advantage of being a a Swede and a European, which is an opportunity for Europe to take a bigger and more important role in negotiations. And I think the place where he is most in a position to get assistance from the US is at the United Nations, where although the UK is the official pen holder at the UNSC, the US obviously has enormous influence. And this would be a place where I think the US could play an important role. I will just mention extremely quickly the 3 actions that have been taken by the Biden administration since it took over. First was the removal of the Houthis from the list of foreign terrorist organizations. The second was the appointment of its own special envoy. And third was the claim of stopping the offensive arms sales to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which brings up to a number of issues, which obviously I have no time to bring up. So I'll just finish by saying that I think, you know, the main losers in this situation are the Yemeni people who are suffering and dying. And I think, you know, this is often forgotten, and that the problem will not be solved until such time as the Yemeni politicians, including warlords, powerful elements, etc., are either ousted or decide to think and focus on the needs and desperation of the population. Thank you. Sorry, I thought I was within time.
Thank you, Helen. Appreciate it very much. Marwan, your time.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Imad. Thank you for the kind invitation. It's a great pleasure to be amongst friends and colleagues speaking about a topic that has been on the news for the past 10 years. And as you all know, there are so many conflicts in the region and the world. And what makes the Syrian conflict unique in a sense as perhaps the external intervention. I think there is no single civil conflict in recent years that has drawn so much external intervention like Syria. At the height of this conflict in 2015, 2016, fighters from more than 82 countries took part in the conflict in Syria. 82 countries took part in the conflict in Syria. They were either affiliated with states or non-state actors, including, of course, the anti-ISIL coalition, US-led coalition, Iran-backed militias, the YPG, sympathizers, Israel, Turkey, Russia, China, because China has sent a small contingent of advisors to help the Syrian regime, and of course, the jihadists from around the world. It's also the first conflict in many years to use chemical weapons on a large scale, perhaps the first one since Halabja, Iraq in 1988, in fact. And also the scale of destruction was massive in Syria. It's unseen in any recent civil conflict. Half of the population were displaced. Around 28% of Syria's housing units have been either completely destroyed or partly damaged. And finally, the resilience of the regime. And I wish I could agree with my friends and colleagues, Brahim Freihat, on his conclusion about the weakness of Arab regime. I think the Arab regimes are very resilient. They are so cruel. They are willing to use all sort of all means actually to cling to power and to stay there. So that was also what makes Syria, I mean, different from other cases. So why everybody is fighting in Syria? Syria is, in fact, in its own right, it's not a very important country. It's a middle-sized country with no much oil or gas. The GDP of Syria in 2010, it was no more than $60 billion. Yet, Syria enjoys a very important strategic location on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. It could act as a transit hub for gas and oil from the Gulf, from Iran, Iraq, Egypt, through Turkey to Europe or via the Mediterranean. And ironically, Bashar al-Assad vision before the conflict was to make Syria the regional linkage par excellence through his 5C theory, linking the Black Sea, Red Sea, Caspian Sea, the Gulf, and the Mediterranean. And Syria is important because it's surrounded by more powerful actors such as Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Egypt, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. And the rivalry between these actors makes Syria very important. Whoever wins Syria is likely to win the battle for the control of the Levant. And in fact, the conflict over Syria is not something new. It in fact started right after Syria's independence in 1946. And I would refer you back perhaps to two very important books that have been written about the conflict over Syria, one by Patrick Seal and the other one by Malcolm Keir, who wrote about the Arab Cold War. And one important part of that Cold War was, of course, the conflict over Syria. So Syria was the scene of a heated rivalry between the three big Arab powers at that time who fought for the leadership of the Arab world: Egypt, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. These three countries, they have supported 15 coup attempts in Syria between 1949 and 1970. And don't forget that the first coup in Syria was engineered by the CIA in 1949. It removed the democratically elected parliament for its opposition to the construction of the TAP line, oil pipeline, to transport Saudi oil to the Mediterranean. And let's forget about history and let's come back to the present time. And let's talk about conflict in Syria after the Arab Spring. It is my opinion that although the Syrian conflict or the Syrian uprising came in the context of the Arab Spring, I believe the conflict in Syria cannot be explained by the Arab Spring. The conflict in Syria, in my opinion, is the fallout of the US invasion of Iraq more than being part of the Arab Spring. Syria could not have survived the ramifications of the US invasion of Iraq in any way, with or without the Arab Spring. There was no way that Saudi Arabia and Turkey would condone the establishment of a Shiite crescent that would cut Turkey from the Arab Middle East, or for Saudi Arabia to accept an Iranian arc of influence in the north of the Arabian Peninsula. The moment the US withdrew from Iraq, as we all know, this window opened for the Iranians to establish their Shiite crescent stretching from Herat in Afghanistan to the Mediterranean, to Beirut on the Mediterranean. Neither the Turks nor the Saudis would accept that. So that is my position, that whether there was an Arab Spring or not, Syria was taking this path. Syria was taking this course because the regional dynamic wouldn't allow actually the establishment of a Shiite crescent in the region. So now let's move to who's who in this Syrian conflict. Let's map this rivalry in Syria. So for this internationalized civil war, or war by proxy in Syria, we can distinguish three major blocks. Each acts as an umbrella for several actors who share certain common interests, but also have competing objectives. So here Syria actually look very much like a maze. So we have to really map the rivalry in order to understand it. The first block is the pro-Assad block, or the pro-status quo. It consists of states and non-state actors. It includes Russia, Iran, China, the Iran-backed militias, and the Russian mercenaries. The major objective of this bloc is to prevent Assad from falling and weaken Western influence in the region. But beyond that, they have nothing in common. The second bloc is the anti-Assad or the pro-change bloc. Here we find much more diverse interests than the previous bloc. Although all these actors seek change in Syria, they differ widely on the degree of change. On one hand, we find the Saudis, the Egyptians, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, and Israel. They all seek to roll back Iran's influence, but they don't see the removal of Assad as a prerequisite to achieving that. This bloc fear the victory of the Islamist forces in Syria as much as they fear Iran. Hence, they see, or some of them at least see, the remaining of the Assad regime as a guarantee against, or a bulwark against, the victory of Islamists on one hand, but they want Assad actually to contain or undercut Iranian influence on the other hand. Hence, these countries actually, they share with Russia and China their anti-Islamist agenda and share with Turkey its anti-Iran agenda. So for them, Assad can stay, but Iran must leave. And I can refer you back actually to the summit between Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and President Putin in St. Petersburg in 2015. And this information actually was disclosed by Al-Jabri, who was the intelligence advisor of Mohammed bin Salman. And he disclosed that Mohammed bin Salman asked President Putin to intervene militarily in Syria in order to prevent a victory by the Islamist forces in, as we know, actually, in the summer of 2015, the Islamists were making ground in the northwest of Syria. So Mohammed bin Salman urged actually Putin to come to the rescue of the Assad regime to prevent the Islamists from taking over the country at that time, and also to undercut Iranian influence. The other group within this bloc includes Turkey and Qatar. These two countries, they see the removal of Assad as a key to solving the crisis in Syria, but they were also wary of a possibility of a possible victory of the Saudi Emirati agenda in Syria, mainly because, as we all know, Saudi Arabia and maybe more, the United Arab Emirates are supporting the YPG in the northeast of Syria, to the dismay of the Turks. The last block, the last of the three blocks actually, is the jihadists. So we have the pro-Assad, we have the anti-Assad, we have the last block is the jihadists, which includes also different groups with different objectives, but generally they reject almost everybody else, including Assad, Iran, Russia, China, the US, the Saudis, and Turkey, etc. And don't forget that we have also the YPG, the YPD. Apart from their animosity towards Turkey, they are willing to change their alliance as it fits. The US is their major ally, but otherwise they can work with Russia, with Iran, and with the Syrian regime. The YPG, the YPD, they seek autonomy at minimum and perhaps independence if the Syrian state break up. Now, if we take the main actors within these two blocks, we have Russia. Russia has no much love lost for Bashar al-Assad. Its intervention is not about saving his regime. It's about its complicated relations with the United States, mainly Obama's reset policy, Libya, Ukraine, and it's about its relations with Turkey and Iran, because Russia sees Turkey and Iran as regional competitors, Turkey more than Iran perhaps. Russia doesn't want either Turkey or Iran or Saudi Arabia to win the conflict in Syria, because this would enhance their regional posture. And for Russia, that was very important factor for intervening in Syria to prevent any of these key players from winning there. If Iran wins, that means the Shiite crescent is complete. If Russia wins, that would mean Turkey rising power will be even stronger. If Saudi Arabia wins, that would also increase the posture, the regional posture of Saudi Arabia. And also for Russia, it was important, Syria was important because of energy politics. We know that how important energy politics is in Putin foreign policy. Russia opposed the Iran-Iraq-Syria gas pipeline. We know that Syria, Iraq, and Iran, they signed an agreement to establish a pipeline that would that would actually pump gas from Iran South Pass oil field, which is sharing with Qatar, through Iraq, Syria to the Mediterranean. So the Russians were very much against that project, and they want to have a say also, the Russians, in the East Mediterranean energy arrangement, especially after the discovery of large quantities of gas and oil in the Mediterranean, in the East Mediterranean. Russia also is using Syria as a tool to reassert itself in the international stages, in the international stage. And there are so many other factors, actually domestic, that made Russia make this decision to intervene in Syria. Iran major objective in Syria is Iran has two major objectives actually in Syria: Israel and regional dominance. Iran is trying to establish its own crescent of influence. It wants to dominate Iraq, contain Turkey's rising power, keep Israel at bay, because Iran is always wary of an Israeli attack. So Iran would want actually to increase its deterrence against Israel, and it wants to secure a safe passage to Hezbollah. Dominating Iraq is very important for Iran, and Iran knows very well that it cannot dominate Iraq if it has a rival regime in Damascus. And that was very clear to the Iranians when ISIL actually invaded Iraq from Syria. Iran knows if there is a rival regime in Damascus, they cannot actually keep Iraq under their dominance.
Marwan, I'm sorry. Could you?
One more minute, and I will finish. Of course, the Chinese, they have no major interest in Syria, but they are trying to defend the principle of non-interference, because they don't want. They are having their own domestic problems, and they don't want actually anybody to interfere in their internal affairs, even if they had to do exactly as Assad did in Syria, using massive force in order to crush their internal opposition. And we know what they are doing with the Uyghur in Xinjiang. And China wants to eliminate the threats by the Turkestan Islamic Party. We know that Turkestan Islamic Party has been part actually of the Islamist movements that are fighting the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Turkey, of course, has objectives. They changed over time. It was the removal of Assad and establishment of a friendly regime in Damascus, containing Iran, undermining the Kurdish aspirations for independence, and eliminating ISIL, especially after ISIL started targeting Turkey in 2016, and its economic interests, of course. Saudi Arabia, major interest is containing Iran and Turkey rising power in the Middle East through or via Syria. And I have to stop here. Maybe I can go through other points during the A and Q. Thank you very much, Imad, for giving this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Marwan. Thank you all for really great remarks, great presentations. This is really a very nice, well-rounded discussion, so to speak, of the unfortunate hotspots and conflicts in the Arab world, considering also there are many other hotspots that we have not been able to cover in this session. But I want to take my prerogative as a moderator and ask each of the panelists one question regarding the country that she or he covered. I will start with Hanan. Hanan, what could scuttle, in your opinion, what could scuttle the elections, the Libyan elections later this year? Harith, I have a question for you. Mustafa al-Kadhimi seems to be hedging his bets. And a couple of days ago, he visited Tehran, apparently to kiss and make up for something supposedly he may have done. Do you think that he is pressured by Iran or its allies in Baghdad to follow a certain path, to do certain things? Hanan, tremendously complicated, just like Libya and the Iraqi situation, tremendously complicated and many multifaceted aspect of things going on in Yemen. Please explain why Saudi Arabia does not want to end the blockade on the Sana'a airport and the Hodeidah seaport and other places. For Marwan, your comment on Turkey and Saudi Arabia really, after the Iraq war, there was no. It was known that Syria will not really last, not because of the Arab Spring, but because Turkey and Saudi Arabia may not have wanted to have a Shia-dominated polity there. But they appear to be now coming around to endorsing Assad, or to at least allowing Assad to stay in power, because apparently he may be the least of the evils that are besetting Syria these days. I'd like you to start answering these questions in the same order that I asked. And we'll get on to some other questions that we received from the audience. Thanks.
I hope you can hear me better at this point. Can you hear me?
You're still, you're still a little staticky, but let's try.
Apologies. I'm not sure what to do about that. I will try to speak slowly. Maybe that will help. So I would say that there are many elements that could happen over the next 3 months before the elections that are slated for December 24th, whether those take place or not. One major issue is the current disagreement over a legal and a constitutional basis for upcoming presidential and parliamentary elections. And many issues with regard to how these laws are being handled or passed. Just to say that, there is obviously from the current head of the House of Representatives, who apparently simply passed a law without a vote on it, which is not a human rights violation, but certainly not a great standard, a law for the presidential elections, which is now being contested. And it's being contested on the basis that it does not fulfill minimum requirements as per Libya's interim constitution. The problem here, like in Tunisia, the constitutional chamber at the Supreme Court is doormat, and it's not functional and hasn't been for some time. So any attempt to be appealing these laws on a legal basis, sort of not using what usually happens, which is malicious, but trying to appeal it legally can be problematic and may happen, but may not happen before some of these elections take place. I think I should also be clear that there is clearly expediency on the part of everyone on the part of everyone in the international community to have these elections happen in order to have their people have a semblance of legitimacy. Currently not the case, because the current government was nominated, more or less. I think the second one, quickly, so the legal basis obviously is a huge issue, and if that passes or not, but obviously there's always a risk of a restart of fighting. There is already fighting happening in southern Libya. There have been skirmishes and fights since the end of the ceasefire, but none that I would call as serious as to be concerned that they could endanger this ceasefire. But still, that is something that could happen. And I would say the third part that I can now think of is, there is a situation where one part of the country votes and another part of the country cannot vote or is not allowed to vote. And since this last law that was passed by the Speaker of Parliament without a vote, appears to favor a presidential system that would favor actors in Eastern Libya, for example, and others as well. There is a possibility that there will be an election date will be set And then certain polling stations will not be able to open because there will be an attempt by armed groups to not let them open. So in short, violence could break out. I think these are the main concerns, really.
Thank you, Harith.
Thanks, Ahmad. When Kadhimi was nominated as a prime minister, he was opposed by several Iranian allied groups. They saw him as not representative of the nature of the results of the 2018 election, which they won a large number of seats in his parliament. The assassination of Soleimani, especially between the Iranian intelligence, the Tala'at, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. And the IRGC was not enthusiastic about Kadhimi. The Tala'at, having worked with Kadhimi before when he was the head of the Iraqi intelligence, were more receptive, actually more supportive.
I'm sorry, Harith, you went off. Oh. Okay, Helen, you can take it.
Okay, well, maybe we'll get him back. The answer to your question is fairly basically what is happening is that on the military front, the Houthis are doing rather well, or even if they are not making much progress in Marib at the moment, but they are basically on the offensive. And the anti-Houthis are really trying to focus on the economic front. And the blockade is very much part of this economic front. But of course, the people who are suffering are the, medical evacuees who should have been evacuated 2 or 3 years ago, according to any number of agreements, and all the issues I mentioned earlier, fuel and food not coming in. So, the fundamental reason, I think, is that the Saudis and the rest are really trying to put much more pressure on the Houthis through the economy, which again, I think is not entirely successful. I mean, they are putting pressure, but the Houthis are surviving. And, it's basically part of the war package. But at the same time, it's worth pointing out briefly that, the Saudis actually do want to get out now. And, have wanted to get out for at least the last 2 years. I mean, the original decisive storm thing, which was supposed to last a few weeks and provide fantastic victory, is now, 7 years old. So I think the reason is basically that they're focusing on the economic side of the war and hoping to get somewhere there, which, is again impacting the population far more than it's impacting the Houthis, just as sanctions in a general way. I mean, we look at Iraq, we look at any place. If you look at the sanctions, that's really where most of the suffering doesn't come with the actual intended target. Nice.
Thank you, Helen. I want to remind the audience that Harith's disappearing is basically an example of what's going on. If he's in Beirut, it's probably the electricity was cut off. So unfortunately, this is a reminder of the dire situation in Lebanon. Marwan, please go ahead.
Yeah, if he's in the Middle East, it's more likely to disappear. Thank you, Ahmad. Thank you for the question. Yes, I agree with you that Saudi Arabia is now accepting Assad, but accepting Assad after 10 years of conflict is completely different from accepting Assad at the very beginning of the conflict, because we have now 4 powers in Syria that are eating Iran influence, eating up Iran influence. You have the United States in the east of the Euphrates. You have the Turks in the north. You have the Israelis who are bombing the Iranians almost day in, day out. And you have the Russians who actually were called in by the Saudis in the first place to limit Iran's influence in Syria. So whoever thinks today that Iran is having the upper hand in Syria, he must be absolutely mistaken about this. If you have these four powers actually competing with the Iranians, Iran is in fact, if we look at these four powers, Iran is in fact, especially if you look at the agreement in the south of Syria last week in Dar'a, for example, it was engineered completely by the Russians. Russian terms for the regime, for the Iranians, for almost everybody. So the Russians are having the upper hand right now in Syria. And Assad, even if he's accepted by the Saudis, by the Turks, by almost everything, he will be much weaker than he used to be. And the Iranians are no longer having this free hand in Syria as they could have actually done before the Syrian conflict. So that is my take on the question.
Thanks very much, Marwan. We just have a few minutes left. I have two general questions that the audience has set in. One by Catherine. I apologize if I butchered the name, Simone. How do non-state actors undermine the development of the countries that you guys covered, both in overall stability, including the rule of law, extrajudicial violence, etc., and accessibility of goods and infrastructure? And the other general question also, to what extent do you see the dynamics of corporate interests, natural resources, and the international political economy manifested in the respective contexts? Hanan, you can start. We'll do the same order. Hanan and then Marwan.
Okay, so I'm seriously hoping that the sound is better now.
Yes, it is.
I'm running out of options. Okay. So, I mean, with regards to non-state actors, I think I would say, to echo Helen, the answer is quite simple. In Libya, currently, you'd be hard placed to find a unit that I would consider to be a state actor. I would say that the situation is not a matter of how do state actors or non-state actors destabilize the situation. The situation is a little bit further developed and a bit more complicated than that. And it has with at the heart of it, obviously, it's a Libyan conflict, but it's also the armed part of these conflict has been kept alive. And the fact that there are so many foreign fighters currently in Libya on the payroll of Libyan parties, but also on the payroll of other governments, including reportedly Turkey and reportedly Russia. So they are the ones that are actually keeping the conflicts and are able to artificially extend conflicts that, at the heart of it are, of course, deep divisions and fault lines within Libya, and that is in the context of Libya, making it very, very difficult to return to what it is that we all want to see, which is this transition from a situation of utter chaos to a situation of respect for the rule of law, a functioning of unified institutions, functioning judiciary, and law enforcement. Killing has been normalized to an extent where there's absolutely no cost attached currently to killing a human being in the country. That would be my short answer to it.
Huh?
Sorry, I thought we were going to do both questions. I think on the issue of non-state actors, when you're talking about Yemen, you have a problem of defining who are the non-state actors. I mean, officially, according to the UN, the only state actor is the internationally recognized government, and everybody else would qualify as a non-state actor. So I think, I think I'd follow very much what Hanan just said about Libya on the topic. Everybody on all fronts are impeding are basically obstructing anything remotely looking like the rule of law, peace, or democracy, or even, you know, organized autocracy. So I think that's really all I could say on the non-state actors. And I admit that I can't remember exactly what the other question was.
The other one was basically a general question on natural resources, corporate interests, the economy. You know, basically, it's another conference for the day. But
Yeah.
try to put in.
I think in the case of Yemen, you know, we're not talking about a major fight for the natural resources, because the country's natural resources are very limited. You know, if you look at its oil or gas resources, they are, you know, by comparison with the rest of the peninsula, insignificant, even if you compare them to Oman. So, you know, really the only economic interest I can see is really the one of the arms dealers. I mean, they are the ones who are doing very well. And you know, I mean, and certainly Yemen's not the only place where this is true. Otherwise, you know, we're talking about a very weak economy. I mean, you know, why is Yemen importing 90% of its basic staples? You know, and when the majority of the people live in rural areas, I mean, we're in a situation where I don't think any external state is in Yemen in order to grab its resources, even if some people would like to imagine so. I think they're all there. And to go back to what we didn't, you know, go on earlier, you know, why are the Western states involved in the US? I mean, originally, you know, I know people who've said very explicitly, you know, US doesn't have a Yemen policy, it has an anti-terrorism policy. So I think, you know, this is one of the situations where, you know, the sort of standard pictures of why intervention happens isn't necessarily actually appropriate to this particular case. I mean, if we look at the 4 countries we're talking about today, you know, Yemen is most definitely the one with least, you know, economic resources that any external agent would be interested in. So I'm sure Marwan can say something about Iraq, where there are real resources.
Yeah, Imad, the question was about non-state actors in Syria, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think today, as we all know, I mean, states are failing in the Arab Mashriq, in the Levant, and non-state actors are actually becoming the main actors on the stage. Take Iraq, take Syria, for example. In Syria, there aren't many armies that are involved in the conflict. They are mainly non-state actors. The Americans, they did not send actually their forces, their infantry to fight ISIL. They were in Syria, depending on the YPG and the Kurdish forces mainly. In Iraq, they were depending on the Shiite militias. The Russians are also relying, they are making the Shiite militias their army on the ground. The jihadists, on the other hand, the Turks are using. So everybody is using non-state actors. I don't think we have a case in recent history that non-state actors have been playing the key role in any conflict like the Syrian conflict. And even in the post-conflict situation, it's very likely that non-state actors will be playing a very instrumental role. Like, for example, Hashd al-Sha'bi, the popular mobilization in Iraq, they are becoming deputies in parliament right now. They are having their arm wing, and they have their political wing, one in parliament and the other one actually that defy the government in the streets of Baghdad. This is likely to happen also in Syria. In Lebanon, we know that Hezbollah actually is the kingmaker. In Yemen, we have that. So mainly, we are seeing the rise of non-state actors in the Middle East, but it's in fact, this is in nobody's interest at the end of the day. The international system is a system of states, and this is where the Western powers, mainly the United States, must actually act in order to help rebuilding states in the Middle East, because dealing with the states is, there are rules. But dealing with non-state actors, I mean, the rules are completely different. So that is what I think, Ahmad, on this issue.
Thank you, Marwan. Appreciate your answer. Thank you to our panelists. Great presentations, great comments, really. And we thank you very much for participating in our conference and in this panel. You definitely have made some really good impression, I think. Please stay tuned. We're gonna take a little break here. Stay tuned for our next panel titled "Weapons Sales in the Middle East: Economics, Prices, and some other things." Anyway, I can't see my screen here. And priorities and the human cost of that. Thank you very much, and we'll see you. Follow our events and read our stuff on ArabCenterDC.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmad. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And apologies for the sound issues earlier.
No, it worked. It worked okay, Hanan. It was all right. Just the beginning was a bit scratchy.
شكرا جزيلا عماد. شكرا على
Thank you, Abba.
شكرا. اللقاء.
Can I get everybody to do an audio and video check real quick?
Hi, everyone. This is Yara. Looking forward to moderating.
Hi, this is Shayna. Can everyone see me?
Perfect. Charles? Charles, I can't hear you.
Looks like you're muted, Charles.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I was just connecting to the headphones. Yeah, okay. Can you see me? I can't see me.
Yes,
Okay.
we can see you. Let's see here.
Oh, there's Alexandra. Welcome, Alexandra.
Hello, thank you so much. I don't know whether I should turn on my camera or...
Yes, go ahead and turn it on, please. We're going to start in about 1 minute.
Alexandra, could you let me know how to pronounce your last name? I'll be moderating.
Alexandra Kuimova.
Kuimova. Okay, thank you. Good luck, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I've had to put headphones on because, of course, they chose this moment to do road work.
Rachel, headphones don't work very well usually. Could you try it without, please?
I can, but I will tell you that there could be significant construction noise without, but hear me okay?
Yeah, that's a lot better. For some reason, headphones pick up the hum of the computer and a lot of feedback comes through, so.
Okay.
All right, is everybody ready?
I also have a
Yes.
couple leaf blowers outside. These are my headphones. Is this okay, or would you like me to take those, unplug those?
That's fine.
They're okay?
Yeah. All right, we're gonna start in about 30 seconds. Yara, as soon as you see the banner, the intermission banner come down, go ahead and start, okay?
And
All
we
right,
should all
sounds
we
good.
should all turn on our video when you start.
You can keep your video on, but please keep everybody muted except for Yara until it's your turn to speak.
Great.
And I'll give everyone a 2-minute warning via private chat when you're at 10 minutes.
Rachel, can I ask you to do another audio check, please?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, that's fine. And then Shanna, one more time, please.
Yes, is this okay?
Yes, great,
Okay,
thank you.
great.
All right, Yara, I'm going to take down the banner. You can start once I take it down.
Good afternoon and welcome to this panel titled Weapons Sales in the Middle East, Economics, Priorities, and Human Cost. My name is Yara Asi. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Central Florida and a non-resident fellow here at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. I have the honor of sharing the screen with a very impressive group of experts who will discuss trends in international arms transfer and weapons exports to the region and the role of the U.S., Russia, and China. This is a topic that has been especially in the news lately due to the ongoing situation in Afghanistan and some criticisms about arms sales to Egypt. Our panelists today will try to answer questions about the objectives and priorities of arms exporters to the region, the humanitarian dimension and the human costs of weapons sales, US policies and regulations tied to arms sales, and policy recommendations for the Biden administration. So I will briefly introduce today's panelists in speaking order. So first we'll have Alexandra Kumova, a researcher with the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute's Arms and Military Expenditure Program. Her research and extensive publications focus on defense policies, monitoring arms transfers, arms procurement, and military expenditure in the MENA region and post-Soviet states, and Russian arms exports to the MENA region. Charles W. Dunn is a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Before joining ACW, Charles served as a U.S. diplomat for 24 years and was the director of Middle East and North Africa programs at Freedom House. His research and expertise centers on U.S. foreign policy, democracy and human rights, and regional security. Next, we have Shana Marshall, an assistant research professor of international affairs and the associate director of the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. Her areas of expertise include Middle East political economy, global weapons trade, and corruption. Her current research focuses on patterns of military entrepreneurship in Egypt, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates. And our last speaker today will be Rachel Stoll, the Vice President of Research Programs and Director of the Conventional Defense Program at the Stimson Center, and an adjunct professor in the Security Studies Program at Georgetown University. Prior to joining the Stimson Center, Stoll was an associate fellow at Chatham House at the Royal Institute of International Affairs and a senior analyst at the Center for Defense Information. So many thanks to these wonderful panelists for taking the time to join us today. Before I turn to our speakers for their remarks, I'd just like to remind the audience, please submit your questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom, or you can also email events@arabcenterdc.org. So I will now hand it off to Alexandra to start our panel. And Alexandra, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to say again, thank you for this kind invitation. And it is an honor for me to be part of this important panel discussion. I will start my presentation, my remarks, with providing a concise overview of trends in arms transfers in the Middle East and North Africa, and then I will speak about the role of Russia in the region as one of the largest arms suppliers. In my presentation, all statistics will be based on data on arms imports and exports that we at CIPRI collect, verify, analyze for our CIPRI arms transfer database. And as the volume of deliveries can fluctuate significantly year on year, I will present and compare data for 5-year periods in order to give you a more stable measure of trends. So what we can observe by looking at arms transfers and military expenditure data in the Middle East and North Africa countries is that the region is undergoing and has been undergoing rapid militarization, with nearly all MENA states directly or indirectly involved in regional conflicts, while simultaneously accumulating major arms. The volumes of major arms imports in the region have grown significantly over the last decade, illustrating the importance given to military capabilities by the MENA states. Arms imports by states in the Middle East and North Africa were 23% higher in 2016-20 than in 2011-2015. So as I mentioned, I will provide trends in comparing 5-year periods. And according to our data, 5 of the top 10 arms importing states in 2016-20 were in the Middle East and North Africa. And these are Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Algeria, Qatar, and the UAE. Altogether, these states accounted for almost 30% of total volumes of arms imports in the world, and I think this number is quite substantial. Almost all these states increased its arms imports between these two periods of times, 2011, 2015, and 2016-20, by more than 60%, with the exception of the UAE, which arms imports fell over the period. Overall, the MENA region accounted for 38% of the global arms imports in 2016-20, while in 11-15, the region accounted for 31%. States in the region received a high number of weapons from several large arms suppliers, including the United States, Russia, several European states, and China. So in 2016-20, or the last 5-year period, the USA was the largest exporter of arms in the region, accounting for 47% of all arms imports to the Middle East and North Africa, while Russia supplied 19%. France was the 3rd largest arms supplier, and I will also say a couple of words about China, since we're going to discuss it today. China accounted for only 2% of all imports to the Middle East and North Africa. However, I will also mention later that it wants to develop further cooperation with the states. But what does the data shows us if we look at the volume of exports by these states? So I talked about imports, the importer side, but what can you say about exports? So the question to be answered is whether the MENA region is prioritized by arms exporters as one of the main arms markets. And the answer is quite simple. Yes, it is by several arms suppliers. So for example, almost half of the US arms exports went to the Middle East and North Africa. In 2016-20, MENA accounted for 15% of Chinese total arms exports. And as for Russia, now it's time to talk about Russia. So as for Russia, the Middle East and North Africa is the 2nd most important and growing foreign market for Russian arms sales after Asia and Oceania. In 2016-20, it accounted for 36% of all Russian exports. Algeria and Egypt were the largest recipients of Russian arms in the region, accounting for 15% and 12% of Russian exports in 2016-20, respectively. Moreover, Russian arms exports to these states increased significantly over the last decade. I will not tell you the percentages because I think you're already quite lost with the numbers. Speaking of Russia, arms exports have traditionally been a core element of Russia's cooperation strategy with the Middle East and North Africa. Arms sales to the region support Russia's political and security interests and play a quite important role in Russia's economy. And I said quite important, not super significant, because energy resources sector still dominates in terms of income. But if we talk about manufactured products or products manufactured for exports, then of course arms industry plays quite important role here. And at the same time, if we talk about the MENA countries, acquiring arms from Russia allows them to diversify their sources of arms supply and obviously become less dependent on Western suppliers. This, of course, enables and encourages Russia to compete with other established arms suppliers in the region. Arms exports are also a tool of Russia's broader foreign policy, which allows Russia to build and strengthen long-term relationships, and thus create dependencies, because as we know, arms deals involves maintenance of weapons and training of weapon operators. So therefore, it's a long-term relationship commitment in a way. And by doing this, Russia wants to promote itself as a reliable partner to the MENA states, often more appealing than countries in the West. But I should also mention that this is not new, this is not a novelty, as several major powers in the region, including the United States, are using arms transfers as a foreign policy tool to increase its presence and influence in the Middle East and North Africa region. So by developing political and economic ties with the majority of states, Russia is willing to strengthen its political influence in the region, strengthen its economy, and further develop economic cooperation with states in the region beyond arms sales. Another objective or another driver behind Russia's arms exports to the region probably should be also mentioned. It's the shared threat perception, such as terrorist threats. So sometimes Russia, similarly to the United States, can explain exports to the region by securing regional stability. So at the same time, many countries themselves do look towards Russia when it comes to arms procurement. As I already mentioned, they can diversify sources of weapons, but at the same time, Russian arms sales come with fewer political conditions compared to the US or some of the Western arms suppliers such as France or Germany. To illustrate this complex supplier-recipient relationships, let me just discuss one concrete example, also for the audience, just to understand a little bit what is happening. So I want to use Egypt as an example. So Egypt is the world's largest importer of major arms, and Egypt invested heavily in modernizing its armed forces recently. But what changed recently, especially after 2013, is that before the US used to be the largest arms supplier to Egypt, but after the military coup in 2013, when the US administration decided to cut substantial military aid to Egypt and delay planned deliveries of military equipment to Egypt, Russia decided to offer Egypt its, wouldn't say help, but arms that Egypt was looking for. And the soaring of relationship between Egypt and the US was a driving factor for strengthening the relationship between Egypt and Russia. And just to mention that Russia was quick enough to confirm its willingness, and that's what Egypt actually liked, because Egypt really wanted certain types of weapons. And even though after some time, US decided to still continue providing military aid to Egypt, that was a turning point, in my view, between Egypt and Russia's relationships. So Russia and Egypt signed many arms deals, including for procurement, combat aircraft, combat helicopters, air defense systems. And one of the latest interesting deals is the deal for procurement of Russia's fighter jets, Su-35. This actually gained widespread attention recently, especially with regard to CAATSA sanctions and other aspects of this deal. So what we can observe now is that Russia emerged as the largest supplier of major arms to Egypt, and relations between Russia and Egypt currently go beyond arms sales and have recently reached a new level of cooperation in other areas, in investment, in I should probably also mention military exercises and develop a nuclear power plant. So now the relationship goes much beyond than it was a couple of years ago. So it was an example I wanted to show how Russia uses arms sales as the way to strengthen its relationships with countries in the region. And it is important to highlight as well that Russia's objectives in the MENA region is a part of Russia's so-called grand strategy more broadly, because in addition to the Middle East and North Africa, Russia is willing to continue to develop relationship with Asia and increase cooperation in states in Africa, for example. Africa, I think it's another platform for competition between Russia, US, and Western suppliers, and continue to build military cooperation with several states of former Soviet Union to raise its international status and consolidate its role as an important player and military actor. So I thought this is important to highlight that, yes, Russia is interested in the Middle East and North Africa, but at the same time is still looking around to develop relationship with other regions. And I think I will stop now. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. That was a great, I think, introduction to the topic and really will lead us nicely into the remaining panelists. I want to remind everyone, please submit your questions either via the Q&A or via email. And let's move on to our next panelist, Charles Dunn.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the Arab Center for hosting this very important panel, which I think is becoming an increasing issue as we determine what Middle East policy should be going forward over the next few years of the Biden administration. So I would like to start by asking, what is the strategic rationale for U.S. arms sales to the Middle East, which, as Alexandra pointed out, absorb nearly half of global U.S. arms exports? Now, Dana Stroul, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Middle East at the Department of Defense, put it pretty succinctly in congressional testimony last month. And she said that U.S. arms transfers to the Middle East are part of an overall security cooperation framework, which is aimed at building self-reliant, capable, and accountable partner forces who work alongside the United States to achieve mutual objectives based on a shared view of the threats to regional stability and security. Now, the assumptions built into this strategy are important if we're going to evaluate how effective the strategy has been. So what are these assumptions? And I have about 6 of them, and I'd like to list kind of briefly. First of all, the first assumption is that arms transfers, in addition to other forms of security cooperation, will protect American interests by enhancing partners' abilities to defeat and defend internal and external threats, especially transnational terrorist threats. The second is that arms transfers and training will help deter Iran, which the US sees as perhaps the most important destabilizing factor in the region of the Middle East. Third, arms transfers will enhance the ability of regional states to cooperate on a multilateral basis, work together on shared security concerns. This is important, largely independent of the United States. That's the aim and the assumption. Number 4, which is not as frequently stated up front, but is nevertheless critically important, is that arms sales and transfers buy influence and clout with governments in the region, which enables key regional goals. Examples of this are, of course, the Egypt assistance program, where arms transfers are not only supposed to undergird Arab-Israeli peace, Egyptian-Israeli peace, but they're supposed to make Egypt a strong, capable partner of the U.S. on many security issues, including counterterrorism. And of course, sale of the F-35s to the UAE was an important factor in encouraging the signing of the Abraham Accords under the Trump administration. Number 5 is that arms transfers will enhance regional stability by edging out Russia and China. Now, Dana Stroul in her testimony openly acknowledged this, as has General Frank McKenzie, the commander of CENTCOM. They are a major tool to push Russia and China to the sidelines. And finally, number 6, and this is an assumption that Dana kind of got at in her testimony too, recipients of U.S. arms will be accountable for the responsible U.S. Use of the arms that we provide. And they'll be made responsible through exposure to U.S. values, and this will be inculcated through training, through adherence to the laws on arms transfers, and so on. So you take a look at the strategic rationale for our arms sales, and you have to ask the question whether they have actually worked to achieve these objectives. In other words, what have they actually accomplished in the real world? How effective they have been? And I would say that there is ample reason for doubt, having dealt with this issue for a number of years. U.S. arms sale to Saudi Arabia, for example, they haven't done much to promote regional security, as the war in Yemen demonstrated quite clearly. And U.S. arms are arguably not only prolonged the war, but has made the humanitarian crisis that much worse. The provision of U.S. arms to Egypt has resulted in a number of things, including enriching the Egyptian military complex, but it's also enabled them to pursue a rather heavy-handed and largely secret campaign of counterterrorism in Sinai against an ISIS affiliate, which has reportedly had very heavy costs for the civilian population there. And of course, U.S. arms have helped the UAE and others intervene directly in Libya, often in contravention of U.S. policy goals towards that country. Take a look at Iran. You know, deterring Iran from regional adventurism is an important goal of U.S. arms transfer policy. And has that worked? Well, arguably, no. U.S. support of Saudi Arabia not only enabled the campaign to be prolonged, but it helped open the door to greater Iranian involvement in Yemen. Iranian adventurism is alive and well in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. And of course, the presence of major U.S. weapon systems such as the Patriot haven't really prevented Iran from launching an occasional attack, such as the 2019 drone and missile strike on a major Saudi oil facility. So, you know, I would argue that at least in terms of deterring Iran or preventing Iran's regional destabilizing activities, it hasn't really worked all that well. And of course, the Russians and Chinese haven't been deterred either. As Alexandra pointed out, the Russians are very active in their arms trade. In fact, they're selling arms to most American regional partners. And both Russia and China, who is also, of course, an arms supplier on a much lower scale, are continuing to score economic and political deals as well. And if you're looking at the strategy of arms transfers in terms of have we created more self-reliant U.S. partners, I think the answer has to be no. We have not built up any of the Arab militaries that we deal with to the point that they can cooperate multilaterally on an issue of mutual security concern without substantial American assistance, especially lift capacity and resupply and the like. And this leaves entirely aside as to whether regional partners are willing to cooperate with one another, which is another story altogether. And it seems to me that part of the problem here is that the Arab militaries to whom we sell many of our weapon systems are generally speaking looking for the most modern, most expensive, most visible types of weapon systems, often at the expense of their real defensive needs, which usually center on more basic counterterrorism and border control equipment. But those don't enhance the prestige of militaries and governments nearly as much as, say, the F-35s will. And that has been a real problem in Arab procurement. And the fact that the United States has been not that successful in pushing back against that, although it has been trying for a number of years, is kind of an indicator of how little success we've had in this particular goal. In terms of influence, I don't believe that U.S. arms sales to the region have bought influence with the governments, or at least not nearly enough influence to counter the troubling domestic and international behaviors of some of our friends and allies in the region. In fact, it seems to me the influence often runs the other way. U.S. arms exporters become dependent on the Middle East market, and continued arms sales to a number of these governments creates a sense of obligation, security obligations, political obligations to the recipient governments on the part of the U.S. military and the U.S. political administration. And governments in the region have been able to leverage this sense of obligation and dependence to manipulate US policy in many instances by threatening to withhold cooperation on on certain issues unless their needs are served. So I do not believe that we have created access to the leaderships for certain with our arms sales. We've created access to bases, overflight clearances in many cases, especially with Egypt. But in terms of real political influence, it's been quite limited. Now, and I'm sure the other speakers are going to touch on this too, but I'd just like to mention it briefly. What arming repressive states in the region has accomplished, however, is help make these regimes more confident and capable in the repression of their own citizens. We have seen from the wave of authoritarian repression since the Arab Spring uprisings of 10 years ago. And it's also, and this is really critical, created a web of patronage and corruption that has enhanced regime and military power, not only at the expense of citizens, but at the expense of transparency and accountability, all of which runs counter to stated US goals for its arms transfers policy in the Middle East. Now, this being the case, why isn't there more pressure to reevaluate and redefine US arms transfers policy to the Middle East? And to my mind, in a nutshell, it comes down to money, politics, and inertia. Let me explain what I mean. It seems to me that arms sales are increasingly divorced from a meaningful strategic rationale. Instead, they justify themselves by virtue of the profits they generate and the other economic activity that goes in its wake. And this comes not just, of course, from the hardware sales, but from the extensive logistics train that tails in its wake, which includes provision of spare parts, training, maintenance, and so on, employing thousands of American citizens. And it integrates recipients of American arms into the logistical chain of the US military, which is very, very difficult to disentangle. Moreover, a lot of this work, in fact, the bulk of this work, defense production, is distributed by defense companies to as many congressional districts as possible. So this creates a huge amount of buy-in on arms sales from Congress and support for the diplomatic policies that the arms sales are supposed to undergird. And that makes it even more difficult to change. In addition, and this should be mentioned, the kind of revolving door of DoD personnel, ex-congressmen, congressional aides from government service into the private sector, where they often go to work lobbying for the Middle East states who import substantial quantities of arms, really constitutes an industry in itself, both of money and of influence. And it's a major factor in keeping this whole perpetual motion machine going. I mentioned inertia, and here's what I mean by that. It seems to me that the national security justifications that we just discussed for continued arms transfers have become basically received wisdom over many, many years, just through sheer force of repetition, even if they're out of date. You know, for example, the State Department talking points on why we supply security assistance to Egypt and have since 1979 have rarely changed in the last 20 years. And I know because I used to write these 20 years ago as political military officer in the embassy in Cairo. Circumstances and Egypt's relative clout in the region have certainly changed, but the rationale for why we continue to provide this has not. And that's what I mean by inertia. Now, if such circumstances, justifications are in some ways a fiction, at least they're an agreed upon a fiction between US administrations and diplomats and the countries that they deal with. To question these assumptions is seen as radical and destabilizing, not only by the military industrial complex that benefits from the arms sales, but by the countries who receive these weapons. So really the path of least resistance is the safest. By not questioning the rationales for these arms sales and continuing to do business as usual, US diplomats can avoid ruffling feathers and keep the relationship as smooth as possible, which is usually the goal of our relationships with most of these countries, if I allowed a little bit of cynicism there. Now, the Biden administration has indicated that it plans some major shifts in the way it prioritizes arms sales to the region, emphasizing human rights and emphasizing defensive weapons. And they did do a pause in arms sales to the region very briefly at the beginning to reevaluate. But the early decisions that came out of this are cause for some concern. The administration proceeded with a $23 billion arms sale to the UAE, including the F-35 fighters. It gave $197 billion or $197 million in a missile deal to Egypt, despite human rights concerns. And of course, just yesterday, after a lot of dithering for a period of months, the US released the bulk of $300 million in military assistance to Egypt, which had been held up by human rights concerns. And I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A period. So let me just wrap up here. How much change then can we really expect from the Biden administration in terms of arms sales policy? I think that remains very much to be seen. And I'd only point out that over the last 12 years, there's been remarkable consistency in what the US does overall in terms of arms sales. Foreign arms sales under Trump amounted to about $57 billion per year in 2020 dollars, as opposed to about $53.9 billion under the 8 years of President Obama. So it might be unwise to expect too much of a shift in overall arms sales, and certainly arms sales to the Middle East under Biden. And let me just make this last point here. I think there's a good possibility that arms sales to the region could accelerate under Biden if he's really serious about transferring military and diplomatic attention to the Indo-Pacific region. That requires strong and capable partners to maintain some kind of stability regime. And that in turn, by the logic of the United States' own regional security strategy, would likely depend on accelerated arms sales to the region to expand their capabilities to deter Iran and enforce such a regime of stability. Time will tell, but I think that would be the direction it would most likely trend in. So with a new administration in place, the withdrawal from Afghanistan complete, we're now in a time of really extraordinary flux, and I would say an extraordinary opportunity to take a much closer look at our assumptions and our general rationale for arms sales to the Middle East, and to adjust them to some of these new realities accordingly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. I really enjoyed that framing of the assumptions because it makes it quite clear how often they bump up against the realities that we're seeing in the region. I'd like to turn next to our next speaker, Shana Marshall.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I'd like to, for people interested in these topics, direct them to a few really great resources, one of which is the Middle East Research and Information Project, which is a 50-year-old magazine covering the region, available at marip.org. It's all open source and has a lot of great information on the history of arms transfers and weapons sales to the region. As well as a newer project called the Security in Context Project that also confronts a lot of these issues. Somewhat conveniently, Brown University's very well-known Costs of War project just this month updated its post-9/11 tallies on the costs of US wars since 9/11, which now amounts to $14 trillion, a third of which, or even one half of which, went to private military and security contractors, and also updated the human toll of direct war deaths, meaning those who were directly killed in bombings and other military actions, to almost 1 million. That doesn't include, of course, those who died of all of the secondary effects of war, such as war-related disease, the destruction of critical infrastructure, which causes inadequate access to water or sewage treatment systems, suicide, refugees who died in the process of fleeing war zones, and the poverty and dislocation that are exacerbated by conflict. Nor does it include those who were seriously maimed. So if we include those tallies, the figure grows into the many, many millions. A key component of those secondary effects that will only increase with time is the death toll from poisoning and destruction of the environment from toxic weapons materials like depleted uranium. Increased incidence of cancer and serious birth defects in Iraq, for example, come from the use of anti-tank weapons that contain depleted uranium, which is a radioactive material that's used to coat munitions so that they can pierce tank armor. The pulverizing of infrastructure during air bombing campaigns, such as that carried out against Yemen, produces what researchers refer to as conflict rubble, which has similarly devastating impacts on health. This rubble dust contains cement, metals, PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls, which are highly toxic substances used in industrial applications in buildings, as well as silica, asbestos, and other synthetic fibers, all of which cause devastating respiratory diseases and cancers. In addition to their direct health effects from imminent exposure, these materials poison water sources and agricultural land, which lead to additional death and disease from contamination and starvation. All this carnage is due to ordinary conventional weapons, of course, that are produced not just in the US, Russia, and Europe. Those are the military industrial core countries, but increasingly in other countries as well. Many of the most productive secondary producers of weapon systems are those whose arms industries were subsidized with major funding and technology transfer from the US. In the Middle East and North Africa, this includes the cases of Israel, Turkey, Iraq in the 1980s, and then again after 2003, Iran under the Shah, post-Nasser Egypt, Jordan, and the Gulf states, primarily Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, all of which have been the recipients of enormous support from the US arms industry, either through financing, technology support, or both. US doctrine in the latter half of the 20th century promoted the growth of regional militaries and their weapons systems as a sort of proxy for US interests in the region, which has created a legacy of highly weaponized governments with disproportionately large rates of military spending in relation to overall government spending. As the capacity of the US imperial presence in the region has noticeably weakened, of course, these countries have expanded their own efforts to develop indigenous weapons industries, often through partnerships with other foreign suppliers from China, Eastern Europe, and South Africa, as well as through intra-regional partnerships that join Gulf financing with the existing military industrial capacities of countries like Egypt, Jordan, and Algeria. These efforts are often rhetorically framed less in geostrategic terms and more as efforts to diversify economic activities and to industrialize their economies, especially in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Here, the history of the US and Europe is very instructive, where a century of state-subsidized military industrial activity was promoted as the foundation of advances in civilian technology and economic growth. It also reflects the increasing focus on high-cost technologies in the development of new weapon systems, including things like machine learning or AI for weapons and intelligence applications, which fits particularly well with the Gulf economies because of their capacity to provide high levels of financing to their own domestic firms. The fact that most multinational military producers and large service providers now have a significant executive presence as well as increased R&D facilities in the Gulf is no coincidence, because they see these states as the future of markets for their products and as sites for future assembly, development of new systems, and as bases for sales to the rest of the world. Supply chains for major weapon systems are already quite dispersed, with components for many US systems coming from places like China, as well as from sweatshop-style maquiladores factories in Mexico along the US border. Outsourcing weapons production in this way not only reduces prices for the private firms that build weapons, but also creates new political constituencies to support the continued production and the continued state subsidizing of weapons systems. It further weakens efforts to control the proliferation of weapons, as well as all but the most advanced systems are assembled and marketed in more and more countries. This is why we should really examine the military-industrial complex as a global actor and as a quintessentially capitalist actor, rather than as a domestic or a nationalist industry that is subject to the political control of a single country. Perhaps the most visible illustration of this reality is the funding that comes from the weapons industry that goes to think tanks and consulting firms to consistently support the expanded provision of arms transfers, new weapons technologies, and related training to pretty much every corner of the globe, and to provide expert analysis to argue in favor or to argue against even the most modest controls over weapons exports. One would be very hard pressed, in fact, to find any think tank in Washington that is consistently arguing in favor of enhanced export controls. This was not necessarily always the case, as during the Cold War, there were initiatives in the US that focused on the control of the spread of conventional weapons. But the interregnum between the fall of the Soviet Union and 9/11 was a period of declining profits for the military-industrial complex, which responded by spending large sums lobbying against these arms control initiatives and against the continued funding of agencies that focused on arms control and disarmament. So all we're now left with is organizations that focus overwhelmingly on the control of non-conventional weapon systems such as nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, despite the fact that conventional weapons are the ones responsible for the vast majority of death and destruction. And as we have seen very clearly in the history of US interventions in the Middle East and elsewhere, very easily wind up in places far from their original point of shipment. But unlike non-conventional weapons, conventional systems like tanks, guns, and missiles are part of a highly profitable and incredibly influential private sector industry. The increased spread of the production and development of conventional weapon systems, of course, has a direct impact on the strength and influence of the domestic military establishment, which is very visible in cases like Egypt, as well as increasingly in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, where inter-regional military interventions are increasing. The parallel proliferation of facilities for housing and maintaining these weapon systems, as well as military bases and platforms for deploying these weapon systems itself, creates new incentives for war, as has been demonstrated empirically in scholarship on the United States and its 800 overseas military bases and the presence of its troops in over 100 countries. Essentially, the presence of vast military resources increases the likelihood of using military solutions to solve problems instead of relying on diplomatic efforts. The last point that I'd like to make is one that's not often taken into account in geostrategic conversations, but this is the costs to the US of maintaining a globalized military presence and the world's largest military industrial complex. $14 trillion is not a meager figure. And although we're essentially borrowing a lot of this money through issuing treasury securities to countries like China and Saudi Arabia, the political costs of that spending in the US have been enormous. Our health and public education infrastructure in the US has been starved of funds, as have other critical priorities like adapting to climate change. So the cost of weapons production is really very much a global phenomenon that has discrete winners and losers. And there are also many losers to that here in the US, primarily among the working class and the poor, who bear the burden of the decline of the US social safety net and the public services that is necessitated by these enormous levels of spending on war and weapons.
Thank you, Shana. I'm glad you touched on those indirect outcomes, like health ailments, cancer coming years later. We need to include those in the costs of war, right? And I think you also really captured the complexity of just how many issues are wrapped up in arms sales, from globalization, climate change, and even domestic poverty. So I'm going to move to our last speaker. I already see some really interesting questions in the Q&A. So if you have any questions, please submit them via Zoom, or you can email events@arabcenterdc.org. And now I will turn to our last speaker, Rachel Stoll.
Thanks, Yara. Thanks to the Arab Center Washington for this opportunity. And I just want to thank my fellow panelists. There's always benefits and costs to going last. The benefit of this presentation is certainly that I got to hear such interesting information from all of you and really put what I have to say into some context. I think what I'll do is focus around my remarks around how the United States has played a role in arms exports to the Middle East, how that role sort of devolved a little bit under the Trump administration, and then finish with some steps that the Biden administration can take to chart what I would say is a more responsible course, and perhaps not just in the region, but around the world. So Alexandra gave us a really strong background and sort of the data around the arms trade to the Middle East region. We know that the United States has a dominant share of that market, and not just in the Middle East, but really the US leads as the global arms exporter for decades. That market dominance has really only increased in the past several years. And I would say, just to Charles's point, the sales are continuing unabated, despite the Biden administration's commitments to human rights and changing the way that arms transfers have been handled. And I know they have a new conventional arms transfer policy that will be released shortly that will guide sort of the focus of our transfers. But I would say that what we are seeing so far demonstrates that perhaps is more rhetoric than actual deeds. Just this week, as was mentioned, the administration decided to provide $170 million in military aid to Egypt, ostensibly for counterterrorism, border security, and nonproliferation. Those are all great words. Additional $130 million was promised as well on the condition that Egypt ends prosecutions against civil society organizations and drops charges against 16 individuals. All $300 million in assistance was conditioned on human rights benchmarks by Congress, which the administration has now evaded by using a vague and previously unused provision of law. Egypt isn't alone. As of January this year, the US had a staggering $126.6 billion in active government-to-government arms sales cases with Saudi Arabia, on top of billions of dollars worth of previously authorized commercial sales. These are not insignificant weapon systems that have been promised. The United States and Qatar have enjoyed a lucrative and extensive defense relationship for more than 25 years. The State Department has over $26 billion in active government-to-government arms sales with Qatar as of July this year, making it the US's second largest foreign military sales partner in the world. Has already authorized the export of over $2.8 billion in defense articles via the direct commercial sales process since 2016. So again, another major recipient of US weapons. The UAE is also set to receive advanced weapons. In November 2020, the State Department notified Congress of a proposed $23 billion arms deal with the UAE, consisting up to, this is the sale Charles mentioned, 50 F-35s, up to 18 MQ-9B Reaper drones, a package of air-to-air ground munitions. We saw lawmakers introduce resolutions of disapproval to block the sale due to human rights and diversion concerns, although the Senate failed to pass that law. The agreement was reportedly finalized just hours before President Biden's inauguration. Biden did temporarily freeze and initiate a review of the sale within his first week in office, but the State Department has confirmed since that it planned to move forward with the sales as of April 2021. Now, there is a lawsuit that was filed in December by the New York Center for Foreign Policy Affairs to block the sale. That lawsuit is ongoing, but again, another multi-billion-dollar sale. Security cooperation, including arms sales with Israel, has been an enduring feature of foreign policy for decades. I know sometimes that seems untouchable in various forums, but we can't leave Israel off the table when we're talking about arms sales to the region because of the geopolitics that goes into play with arms sales to that particular country. There are $23.2 billion worth of active foreign military sales cases with Israel as of July 2021. And the US has also sold or provided financing for billions of dollars worth of additional arms sales over the past few years. Each of these importers, like many of the top recipients of US weapons and equipment in the region, have appalling human rights records. And unsurprisingly, US arms exports to the region are routinely used in the commission of human rights abuses, war crimes, and other violations. We often, as was mentioned, think of Yemen as the easiest example of these abuses, where Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners have relied on US weapons and equipment to wage a brutal offensive that has killed at least 18,000 Yemeni civilians and spawned arguably one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. And it's really hard, I want to just emphasize this, to overstate the role US arms sales have played in stoking that conflict. Between 2016 and 2020, arms sales to Saudi Arabia represented nearly a quarter of all of US arms exports and made up 79% of Saudi Arabia's arms imports. They could not wage that conflict without the United States. So sort of to the points that a lot of our speakers or presenters were making, we recognize there are devastating consequences that US arms sales to the region have had, but the US continues to arm these Middle East countries. Charles mentioned these sales are motivated in part by concern that regional actors, including terrorist and insurgent groups, and increasingly Iran, pose a growing threat to the United States and its interests in the region. By arming our partners and allies in the region, we can help keep those threats at bay while minimizing direct US involvement. But I think we also have to recognize that the influx of US weapons and equipment is also driven by political and economic competition. Allowing weapons to flow largely unimpeded to the region, even to some of the world's worst human rights abusers, opens the door for the US to compete directly with Russia and China, as Alexandra mentioned, but also with Iran for political influence and for a share of an increasingly crowded global arms market. So while the US has a long history, this is not something new, of flooding the Middle East with weapons and equipment, often with devastating consequences, things took a significant turn for the worse under the Trump administration. Both as a matter of policy and practice, the Trump administration placed an outsized importance on the perceived economic benefit of arms sales to the Middle East at the expense of other foreign policy or security concerns. And this contributed really to a largely transactional US approach to arms sales to the region, one in which arms sales were justified based on the jobs they would supposedly create or the economic gain they would provide. While lawmakers in the House and Senate mounted considerable opposition to delay or block a number of the Trump administration's Middle East arms deals, based at least in part on the very real risk of US weapons being diverted or misused, the administration was able to use a combination of legislative loopholes and vetoes to overcome them. Now, turning to the Biden administration, in some ways, the Biden administration has been worse. The Trump administration was quite clear in its use of arms sales as a business transaction and for short-sighted economic gain. But the Biden administration has claimed it would distinguish itself from Trump's arms sales policy and place human rights considerations front and center. And I just want to remind you of words that President Biden himself said during the campaign. He said, "I would end US support for the disastrous Saudi-led war in Yemen. We will make clear that America will never again check its principles at the door just to buy oil or sell weapons." However, in practice, that is not what we are seeing. In the recent decisions by the Biden administration to allow arms sales to the Middle East, particularly to Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, are really a betrayal of the promised primacy of human rights. You can't say that human rights is a central pillar of foreign policy and continue to sell arms to countries that continue to abuse their own citizens and innocent civilians abroad. I don't buy it. It doesn't work. So what do? I really do believe President Biden has an opportunity to reassess and reimagine the US approach to arms sales in the region and around the world. This isn't just a policy that should be adopted for the Middle East. This really should be the entire approach of the Biden administration towards arms sales writ large. We should be promoting responsibility, mitigate harm, and strengthen international laws and norms. And so there's 4 recommendations I want to quickly mention here. First, the easiest, do not move forward with harmful Trump-era arms sales that are still in the pipeline and reconsider those that have been approved in the first few months of this administration. I guess we're at like 10 months now. I can't really say it's the first few months anymore, but really reflect on those decisions that have been made. Soon after he took office, President Biden initiated a pause and review of several of these Middle East arms sales. In addition to that Egypt sale that was announced, the sale of precision-guided munitions to Saudi Arabia and more than $23 billion in jets, drones, and munitions to the UAE were paused, but the administration has since confirmed that those are almost all of those will be going through. Given the devastating impact that we know that US made weapons and equipment have already had in the region, and the very real likelihood that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt will continue to use US support to commit further atrocities, it would be an enormous mistake to allow these pending sales to proceed. Second, as it considers how it handles Middle East arms sales already in the pipeline and whether to pursue any additional sales, The Biden administration needs to work collaboratively with Congress to afford them a meaningful role in the process. While the congressional attempts to block US-Saudi arms sales under President Trump failed, they were nonetheless remarkable achievements. First of all, we were talking about them, which in and of itself is magnificent, but they were rare and nearly unprecedented displays of bipartisan disapproval from Congress in response to proposed arms sales, particularly to a close ally. Congress seldom critiques proposed arms sales so publicly. And with these votes, a growing number of lawmakers have indicated that they will no longer accept business as usual in providing US weapons to close allies. And it's not just a role for the administration. We should have the administration and Congress working together. And President Biden, who himself was a former senator, should welcome the eagerness to reassert Congress's role in national security and foreign policy decision-making instead of trying to cut them out. As President Trump did when he used an emergency exception to push through an arms sale without the customary congressional notification period. So the Biden administration can afford lawmakers ample opportunity to review and weigh in on proposed sales as they are required to under law. And if and when they do have an objection based on a legitimate security or foreign policy reason, the administration should work to address their concerns, even if it means modifying or abandoning a sale. There's also proposed legislation that Congress could flip the script and develop assistance that requires congressional affirmation for a select set of sales rather than disapproval. Disapproval is a very high bar, but approval could be something that moves things more quickly. And then lastly, the Biden administration should reinvigorate US leadership on conventional arms issues around the globe and reinforce shared commitments with partners and allies. The easiest step is for the US to re-engage in the arms trade treaty process. The Trump administration had unsigned, which isn't really actually a thing you can do, but claimed it was unsigning the treaty. And in the Biden administration should actually reassert that the United States upholds the values and principles for a more responsible arms trade. There's really a lot of work that needs to be done to enhance the laws, policies, and practices surrounding US arms sales and to prevent US weapons and equipment from fueling further violations and instability in the Middle East. Fortunately, there continues to be a real appetite for change, both on the part of the American public, the many lawmakers and administration officials, the dedicated civil society that is quite vocal in its opposition to many of these sales and for promoting more responsible arms transfers. Only time's going to tell how serious the Biden administration is in implementing these and other reforms. And as we near the end of Biden's first year in office, I just want to say the clock is ticking and we are watching. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel. You're pointing out that so many of these arms, including and especially those sold by the U.S., are used to accelerate, some of the worst human rights abuses that we witness. And I think this is really important to mention in any meaningful discussion of global arms. And I think you made that point very powerfully. So thank you. So I see we have some really great questions here. We will try to get through as many as possible. So let me start with, we have a question here that I believe essentially it is, we spend a lot of time talking about these open conflicts, Israel, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, Yemen. What do we do or what can we say about how over-weaponization, militarization in the region is exacerbating these kind of, cold conflicts? They're not open war quite yet. And this person points to the example of Morocco and Algeria. Does anyone want to touch on that? Just go ahead and unmute.
Maybe I can start the conversation. I think it is super important to talk about arms exports and imports in general, especially in the regions where the potential conflict exists. And in this regard, Algeria and Morocco is one of the countries we should always keep in mind when we talk about militarization. So Algeria is one of the largest arms importers in the world, and also it spends quite a lot of money on military expenditure. So Russia exported so many weapon systems to Algeria over the last decades, but also the US exported a lot of weapons to Morocco. So this is something we need to keep in mind that this exports can be used in a very, very negative way, of course, because we have an example of Armenia and Azerbaijan. Similarly, Turkey and Russia was exporting weapons to both sides, and nobody was expecting the conflict to be escalated so fast. But then it happened. So, and all these weapons exported to these countries over the last decade were used during the conflict, and especially, the consequences was horrible, especially with regards to human losses. So same situation can happen in Algeria and Morocco, unfortunately. So therefore, my goal, I think, as a researcher is to provide this data to civil societies, to policymakers, so they can see what is happening in the countries with regard to arms exports, and then use this information in order to prevent conflict in these countries.
Yeah, could I just add to this that, it seems to me that, as I kind of alluded to, the export of arms to a lot of countries creates a sense of obligation, political obligation as well as military obligation to some of these countries. So even in a cold conflict, countries such as Morocco and Algeria that are importing large quantities of weapons from their, international patrons have a sense of backup, and the fact that they are prepared in this way to engage in a hot conflict kind of seems to me lessens the impetus for diplomatic solutions. So I mean that can sometimes result in a shooting conflict, but in other cases it can result in these countries digging in their heels. So in this sense, I would say that the arms sales have certainly not encouraged meaningful diplomatic progress to some of the interstate conflicts, especially involving North Africa.
Thank you. This next topic, we got 2 comments on, and partially they were directed to you, Rachel. So I'll start with you on this question. Do you think there's enough attention given to ethical considerations and the use of captive populations for research and development of arms and surveillance technology? And the examples given here are China and the Uyghur population, and Israel and the Palestinian population.
So I think the ethics in the arms trade is a whole area of research that obviously we were touching on, sort of the trade itself and the impact of the trade, but the ethics behind the decisions to trade are obviously quite significant, and the justifications or the reasons why particular arms sales go forward often are missing those ethical components. Whether it's, the populations that you mentioned, certainly there are numerous cases where weapons have been tested, not just conventional weapons, but nuclear, chemical, biological weapons have been tested on vulnerable populations, where we have seen cases of really horrific injuries, long-term trauma of particular populations. I think as we're thinking about the ethical use of weapons, the ethical trade in weapons, we have to think about risk mitigation. We have to undertake particular strategies, both as exporters and importers, to ensure that across the life cycle of those weapons, that the risk of both diversion and misuse, right? We often it's easier for governments to focus on diversion because then it's not their fault, right? That's not where we wanted the weapons to end up. But there's also this issue of misuse. Were they utilized how they were intended? No one ever on their letter of agreement or offer says, we expect you to use these against your own populations or to terrorize vulnerable civilians. That's never what it says, but there has to be efforts across the life cycle of those weapons to mitigate the risk that those weapons will do harm, not just in the short term, but in the long term as well.
And does anyone else want to add before we move to the next question?
I might. Just to touch on specifically the case of Israel, Palestine, captive populations are always, right, the population that is that is used sort of to test the development of new weapons or any kinds of new technologies, right? Because by their nature, they are essentially powerless, right? And it's recognized that those populations are easily dismissed and that they don't have sort of international standing. And so it's very easy to use them because they're obviously, in the sense that they're captive, they can't escape from that sort of testing laboratory. So this is something that's not just in weapon systems, but in testing all kinds of new technologies, and not just in that particular case of Israel-Palestine, but historically, also in many other cases for the deployment of new technologies and new forms of policing and everything else that sort of goes along with that. So that's an excellent question. And I think there's a lot of good research on that. But it's probably something that needs to be addressed more thoroughly.
Yeah, thank you, Shana. And I want to echo Shana's earlier recommendation to check out MERIP. It's a really great website and resource. So to our next question, all of you kind of talked about this global competition for arms sales and the many cynical reasons, used specifically in the Middle East. So we have a question here. Do you believe that with Russia and China offering stealth technology and drones, will this make the US more willing to offer these weapons platforms to the Middle East to be competitive in this way? Let's go Charles and then Shana.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, absolutely. I believe, and in some cases we are selling drone technology in the region. And until and unless the Biden administration or any other administration decides to do a zero-based review of arms policy and what we intend to accomplish, which has to take in the side effects, again, not just the intended use of these things, but what are the potential humanitarian and human rights side effects of some of these technologies? I think it's going to be evaluated on the basis of how does it fit into our sense of competition with Russia and China? How does it fit into our political relationships with these countries? And the military considerations will be left aside. And economic considerations will be very important. So yes, I absolutely think that in addition to helping to spur an arms race in the Middle East, we're spurring a technology race in the Middle East, and I think drones would be a major focus of that. Again, barring some major adjustments in U.S. arms transfer policies.
This justification about, if we don't sell it to them, someone else is going to anyway, is always the justification that firms use and that their lobbyists in DC use to weaken export protocols. And they've been incredibly effective because there are really very few hard and fast export protocols that are still in place, even when the conditions would suggest overwhelmingly that additional controls and limitations need to be implemented. The carnage of all of the weapon systems that are proliferated throughout the region should be evidence enough that there need to be more firm controls in place. But it also works in their favor, in the favor of producers, because once that technology is proliferated sufficiently, then it allows them to argue for additional subsidies from the government to develop then next generation technologies that are superior to those technologies that are now proliferated everywhere. So it has its own built-in mechanism of encouraging subsidies to the defense industry in the first place, which is of course why they promote it as a geostrategic rationale, when in fact it's very much about commercial concerns.
Thank you. So building off of that idea that we have all heard, if we don't sell it to them, someone else will. What do we think about Russia or China potentially selling nuclear technology to the Gulf states? And this person points to a previous example of China selling nuclear capable weapons in the past to Saudi Arabia. And Alexandra, do you want to start us off with this?
Yes, sure. So I think when we talk about Russia's cooperation or potential sales of weapons to the Gulf countries, we should start with conventional weapons first, not talk about the nuclear technologies, because as we know that the Gulf market is dominated by the Western suppliers right now, and Russia is trying to climb its way towards being a large exporter to the Gulf countries. However, it hasn't succeeded yet. The only example probably is this sale that happened a couple of years ago when Russia actually managed to, for the first time, exported weapons to Saudi Arabia. And that was the first time ever when Russia actually supplied something, and it was the specialized rocket launchers that were delivered to Saudi Arabia. So I think when we talk about technologies transfer, I think we should start with conventional weapons first. So therefore, I cannot answer the question about nuclear technologies because, well, there is no that much cooperation at the moment at all. So, but also again, Russia has its own understanding of weapon exports, and there is not so much civil oversight with regard to this. So I guess we will just see what will be happening with regards to arms supplies.
And does anyone want to follow up on that potential? Yeah, Charles.
Yeah, I would just say I don't see at the moment much of a potential for nuclear weapons technology being exported. Nuclear technology, yes. I mean, the Russians. I'm not sure about the Chinese, but the Russians have definitely been marketing their own nuclear technology in the region, which, you know, as we know, can, without serious safeguards, be potentially converted to a nuclear weapons program. I mean, the Saudis, for one, have been pretty clear in that if Iran obtains a nuclear weapon, they were going to follow suit, and various officials, both in and out of office, have stated that. So definitely the provision of nuclear technology to some of these governments should be cause for concern, but there are quite a few steps between that and actual provision of or creation of a indigenous nuclear weapons capability. But the whole nuclear supply chain really does need to be scrutinized as a national security issue, I think, by the United States.
Thank you. Our next question, I think, stays right in that area of the Gulf states. I think several of you mentioned the Gulf states forming an indigenous defense industry. So do we know, or what do we think about how far those states are from an indigenous defense industry comparable perhaps to that of Europe's?
I can speak on this a little bit. It's interesting, you know, for example, Saudi Arabia has been trying to develop this capability for decades, right? Since the mid to late 80s and 90s, when it had very large arms purchase agreements under the Peace Shield deal with the US and the Al Yamama sales with the UK. They had these reciprocal agreements where the US and the UK would export sort of production technologies to Saudi Arabia in order to establish factories that would produce things like cockpits for jet planes or other items like this. And it got, you know, in some cases, they did end up building these factories and they did end up sort of opening assembly lines. But then that was really halted because the government was very worried about sabotage by the workers in the actual factories, right? That they were going to actually, you know, build in some sort of inadequacies in the products that were then going to go into the weapon systems that would be used by the Saudi military. So to what extent they've sort of solved that issue, I'm not sure. I think the efforts of the Saudi government to sort of engage in regional sort of military adventurism and to sort of build up this sort of patriotic, like sort of jingoistic, very sort of nationalistic sort of fervor among the public is an effort to alleviate those concerns so that it can build up more of an indigenous defense industry. I mean, they're constantly talking about, you know, in Vision 2030, we expect to have 60, 70, 80% of our defense industrial needs produced domestically. I think that's probably very unrealistic. But at a very fundamental level, if they could supply their own sort of spare parts and munitions for the existing systems, the very large systems that they already have, right? The bombs that they need for the fighter jets, or the missile replacements that they need for different systems, they could be much more sort of independent than they are right now. And the UAE, of course, is much more, I would say, further along, because they have been much more comprehensive in their efforts to provide funding and technology inputs to their domestic firms, primarily by just purchasing sort of wholesale firms and factories from Europe and sort of transferring them to the UAE, and then also companies that exist in the US that focus on different military technologies, and then essentially just buying them out and transferring their operations to the UAE. So the fact that both countries have an enormous amount of sort of financial resources that will much further along than if a country that didn't have significant financial resources was trying to do the same.
Thank you, Shana. And does anyone else want to comment on the Gulf and their potential burgeoning weapons industry? So let's turn then from the Gulf. We have a question here about Israel, and we've talked about diversifying who we sell arms to, but what about purchasing? So this person is asking, why is Israel cooperating with China on weapon technologies, and what is the U.S. position on this cooperation? Shana, I think you're up again.
I mean, the history of the Israeli arms industry is basically they'll do business with absolutely anyone, right? They do business with countries that you would typically think that they might not have good relations with themselves. I think that in Israel, whether or not the United States is concerned about their arms export activities is absolutely irrelevant. They don't care what the U.S. thinks about their arms export activities. And that's because U.S. support for Israel in the forms of economic aid and military aid and sort of political cover in the UN and in other organizations has become so entrenched that there is no leverage anymore, right? The U.S. does not have that leverage because the benefits that Israel gets from the United States are seen as sacrosanct and totally untouchable. So Israel coordinates and transfers arms and does sort of technology transfers and lots of forms of coordination with many, many states that I think people would probably find surprising. And I don't see any reason why that is going to change.
Thank you, Shana. I think we have about time for maybe 2 more questions. So if you haven't gotten your question in, it's last call at this point. So we have an interesting question here that's kind of linking the boomerang effect of American imperial foreign policy with what we're seeing domestically. And they specifically point to what happened on January 6th here in the United States, and if that was an early warning indicator. So what are your thoughts on, how this global arms race, this look of, American intervention, all around the world, what does that mean for domestic politics and what the American public, how it perceives such politics?
Let me just start off by saying that, look, I mean, both Trump and Biden ran on this idea of ending the forever wars. They might have had different notions about how to proceed with that, but they were very consistent in their support for that idea. And I think they're tapping into a reserve of war weariness and sort of, in a broader sense, disappointment with the results of the American imperial mission, if I can just say that. We don't want to be the world's policeman anymore. And so, yeah, I think that this argues for kind of a major rethink in how the United States approaches its policy in the Middle East, not worldwide as well, but just to what extent do we have to be involved in the region? What extent do we need troops there? And then that, of course, impacts immediately the question of what do we need to sell these countries in terms of arms and other security assistance in order to at least enable them to maintain the peace. So I think that's very much a debate that's going on right now in Washington. And you've seen quite a few articles coming out by people who specialize in the Middle East for a long time, asking, doing more with less in the Middle East. Is the Middle East even a national interest anymore? So I think that's very much going on. I mean, I'm not sure I can personally draw a connection between that and January 6th, but certainly weariness with the role that the United States is playing in the region and more broadly the world may suggest that whether you're on the right or the left, there's a certain impulse towards retrenchment. And I don't want to say isolationism, but I just said isolationism. I don't think we'll get to that point, but there is definitely something out there politically that speaks to that.
I would just add, I mean, I think there is definite interest in examining the value of accountable security practices in both US domestic and foreign policy, and that those links are being made. And what we do abroad has direct impact on what is happening at home, and trying not to have such a, have a policy for our foreign partnerships and security alliances, and then something that looks very different at home. We've also seen, just in terms of export of weapons, we've seen weapons that have been exported abroad being used by domestic police forces here in the United States. And there's lots of controversy and conversation about that as well. And so I think it's becoming increasingly impossible to divorce sort of our discussion of what are our values and our principles as we're engaging with partners and allies abroad, and how we engage with not only our own domestic population, but what values and principles that we want to represent as a country. So I think that dialogue is ongoing, and I think there's an increasing interest in seeing resolution to that.
I'd really like to echo what Rachel said and point to the Black Lives Matter movement and the indigenous rights movement in the US, and also the BDS movement, the domestic movement for BDS in the US, which have really, I think, done a lot to link domestic repression inside the US to the activities of US imperialism overseas, right? Which has really resonated, I think, a lot with young people, especially. And this new generation, I think, doesn't buy into the myth of the Pax Americana that so sort of dominated previous generations. Also because they're not benefiting from it, right, the way previous generations have, right? Baby boomers, people post World War II, there was really a boom that an economic boom that really people here really felt, and that doesn't exist anymore. And war fighting is just a drain on everyone now. And I think especially the younger generation really sees that and is starting to make those connections.
Yeah, and we'll have to keep an eye on that. I think there's a lot of developments coming forth. So we have just about 2 minutes, and I want to end with kind of next steps. So we have a question here. What do we do about this? What are the best international mechanisms to reduce arms flow? We see almost no appetite for arms embargoes. The UN seems largely ineffective on this. Is it bilateral agreements, de-escalating conflicts? How do we move forward on addressing what I think you've all done an excellent job pointing out is a huge and growing, kind of global crisis?
I mentioned it in my remarks sort of as the last point that I said, but there is an international treaty about responsible arms transfers and establishing national practices that have criteria and risk mitigation and transparency over those decisions so that we know what is going to where, from whom, through what channels, et cetera. And that is the Arms Trade Treaty. And there are, it is actually has tremendous support from arms exporters, far less support, believe it or not, in terms of states parties from arms importers, though there are all many, but very little membership from the Middle East. There are some Middle East countries that are parties to the treaty or signatories to the treaty. But we have to start taking these international commitments and obligations seriously. And when we say there are criteria not to sell when there's a risk that these weapons could be used to commit human rights abuses or violations of international humanitarian law, we have to be prepared to name and shame those countries that continue to violate both their national regulations, but also their international commitments. So there is a tool. I think, you know, bilateral pressure is great. Regional efforts by the European Union, for example, are really important. But ultimately, arms sales are national decisions, and that's where we see varying interpretations and application of existing commitments. And so we need to see that more harmonized and standardized in accordance with existing practice.
I'd just like to add to that, you know, the Cato Institute has something called the Arms Sales Risk Index, which rates countries on the basis of their riskiness as arms recipients, whether it's for corruption, human rights abuses, leakage of arms to terrorist groups or to opposition groups outside the country. Most of the Middle East falls into that category. And the study makes a point that the United States has exported to most of these countries who are in the highest risk categories with very few restrictions. So one thing I think we could do as a country is pay more attention to the risk factors involved in selling weapons to certain countries and take a broader view of that risk, not just is this military organization that we have bilateral relations with going to misuse them, but what are the broader risks in terms of human rights, in terms of corruption, in terms of destabilizing neighboring countries. I think another thing that we can do, you know, frankly, is do a better job of enforcing our own end-use restrictions and our own human rights restrictions, such as the Leahy Law, which forbids export of arms to certain foreign military units that are involved in systematic human rights abuses. I think if we pay more attention to those, and this is quite apart from installing new legislation governing arms sales, I think that in itself could make a big impact into where and how much arms that we sell to a number of different countries. That might at least be a starting point if the Biden administration wants to embark on that.
And I want to hear from both Shana and Alexandra. We have just a few minutes left, so you could just limit your comments to just about a minute, please. Thank you.
Right. I mean, one thing would be to commit more resources to monitoring and regulation, right? Because those capacities in our own government have been stripped over many generations so that there's no one to monitor the factories where these things are being produced and where it ends up. Right. And that was a very intentional, that was something that happened very intentionally because weapons firms knew what the outcome of that would be. And also would be signing on to the ICC. There has to be an enforcement mechanism, a mechanism to hold countries accountable. And if the United States refuses to sort of sign on to the one global mechanism that could actually do that, then I don't see any sort of likelihood that other countries will then hold themselves subject to those rules as well.
I just want to add that I, of course, agree with everything what was said above, but to add, in order to reduce arms flows, we need to control and monitor these arms flows. And in order to know what we are controlling and monitoring, we need to actually know exactly what is happening. So therefore, I think that we should continue to disseminate this information and analysis with regard to these issues and to continue raising awareness on the harmful impact of these arms transfers to the conflict areas and in general, just to contribute somehow to prevention of conflicts in many areas. Thank you.
Thank you all. And I'm glad we got to end on a slightly hopeful note that, this seems kind of out of our control, but there are, mechanisms in progress. It's just a matter of the motivation and incentive to approach them. So thank you to our audience today for joining us today, for all your questions. My apologies, we did not get to every question in time. I encourage you to follow the writing and the work of our panelists. Thank you very much to our wonderful panelists for sharing your time and insights. I personally learned a lot. I invite you all to join us on Friday for the third and final day of this conference. Day 3 will begin with keynote addresses from Joey Hood, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, and Tariq Mitri, the former Special Representative and head of the United Nations Support Mission in Libya. For additional information and to register, please visit arabcenterdc.org. Thank you all and have a great afternoon.